Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the second half of our workshop on food and identity in South Asia since independence. I'm Dr. Peggy Froerer, and I will be chairing this next panel, panel 3, which is comprised of 4 extremely interesting papers. This panel is called Resistance and Beyond, Eating at the Margins. And in this panel, I'll just introduce the speakers. 4 speakers and the titles of their papers. So in this panel, we are going to be treated by papers from Dona Biswas and Vani Xaxa. So Dona Biswas is from Ambedkar University in Delhi, and Vani Xaxa is from Jamia Millia Islamia in Delhi. They'll be presenting a paper called Politics of Tribal Food and Cultural Assertion of Adivasi's Eating Habit. The second paper will be from Priyanka Rajagopalan from NYU Steinhardt, a paper titled Chaat in the Closet, Queer Food Cultures in Southern India. The third paper in this panel is from Aditi Kumar from Ambedkar University in Delhi again. Her title has changed, and I'll just read out the new title. The paper she'll be presenting is called Fermented Foodways, a gendered exploration of fermented food preparation processes in and around Guwahati. And finally, Regina Hansda from the University of Edinburgh will be presenting a paper on Indigenous food and insurgent spaces of nostalgia, solidarity, and reclamation in Jharkhand and Meghalaya. So welcome to all of our presenters. Welcome back to our panel members, the workshop speakers, all of you. And welcome back to our audience on YouTube who are live streaming in. Just a couple of reminders to our presenters and speakers who are currently on Zoom. You all have 15 minutes each, and we ask you very kindly to try and stick to that time frame so that we give all panel members the opportunity to speak fully. We'll then have time for questions after the fourth paper, after the end of the speakers. Unless you are speaking, I think all 4 panel speakers do keep your cameras on. Everyone needs to mute their microphones unless you are speaking or have a question. And otherwise, I think that's it in terms of housekeeping issues. For now, then, I would like to welcome Dona Biswas and Vani Xaxa from Ambedkar University to begin this panel with their paper on politics of tribal food and cultural assertion of Adivasi's eating habits. Welcome, Dona and Vani.
Thank you. I'm Dona and she is Vani Xaxa. So together we'll be presenting our paper. So I'll introduce my paper, our paper, and then side by side we'll be discussing the points or the issues that we wanted to have it from our own field. So first of all, thank you for taking us in this workshop. The title of our paper is Politics of Tribal Food and Cultural Assertion of Adivasi's Eating Habit. With its immense cultural diversity, India is a home to a number of contestations around food and its taste and identity, which see some taste becoming hegemony. In contrast, others at the peripheries of the post-colonial nation-state are relegated to marginalities of culturally different. On this broader canvas of culinary practice, we are increasingly witnessing utter disregard towards this culturally distinct taste compared to mainland Indian taste, maintaining the mainstreaming of caste food. Consequently, these culturally distinct tastes are stigmatized in the broader politics of taste and identity, which ultimately affects how people from different cultures interact at various levels of society. Our paper focused on that aspect of food which hold the spatial meaning of taste, spatial social meaning of taste, bringing the case of Orao and Gond, who are understood as Adivasi, and Boros, the plain tribal of Assam, recognized as the scheduled tribes in the Constitution of India. Whereas the former comes under the 5th schedule, the latter under the 6th schedule, holds the different capacities for right and demand in the debate of self-determination. With the implementation of 6th schedule, there is some flexibility for the tribals enjoying their resources that reflects in their food habit. But culturally, the cultural distinction that has imposed it still remain the same. So to talk about our methodology, our work is based on ethnography by two different researchers located at two different regions in India. Vani engaged among the Orao and Gond Adivasi of Jashpur Nagar and Bijapur district of Chhattisgarh are part of central India. She carried her fieldwork in 2016 to 14 to 16 during her PhD work from sociological perspective. The second researcher, that is me, I come from Assam and I carried my fieldwork there, focused on one of the district of Assam, which is Bodo territorial region. And I focused on Boros in the year, the fieldwork has happened in the year from 2017 to 18. Both of us understood how there are different as much as commonalities that could be traced in the experience of different tribal societies around food, which distinguishes their identity as indigenous and distinct from the dominant society in their state. So both of them bring their ethnographic observation from the field in different capacities in the paper, and we have engaged with the politics of food that function in the cultural life of tribals and Adivasis to bring the analysis closer to interpret how they are marginalized in the narrative on food and food habits. At first, we look how Adivasi food and eating habits are a personal and private affair. However, people or guests are invited to the eating area at the houses, and it should be remembered that getting an introduction to the eating area means you or one is being invited to the family's inner circle. There is a whole lot of background preparation before the eating process begins. Collecting food and firewood, cleaning the cooking area and the immediate area, fetching water, washing the utensil, cutting, chopping the vegetable, etc. The most important ritual in making food is preparing the fireplace or starting the fire. In second part, we look into how animal sacrifice and animal eating is configured by the notion of uncivilized that translate into jungli in the meat-eating practice in tribal societies, and that led by the casteism in India. The notion of purity pollution existed in the caste-ridden society in India, denies the other possibilities of indigenous knowledge production, so much so their values. In the section of gifting pork, we have used pork eating and gifting pig as a community value, which otherwise denied as unhealthy, but to understand for whom. However, there is an existing notion of animism that is attached to tribal identity, which also target their belief system. The still colonial construction of identity transit through extra or less, but not enough to be equals, and thus denied just human condition that constitutes societal values, that is to attach to food, resource, and labor in tribal life. So now, Vani.
Nice meeting you, Peggy, after a very long time. We'll catch up sometime later, but then the paper. My fieldwork with the Gonds, that is the Dona Gond of Bijapur, Chhattisgarh, bordering Dantewada and Sukma. And my fieldwork was from 14 to 16. And I was not studying food at that point of time. I was looking into the politics of counterinsurgency and regrouping that was taking place, initiated by the center and with the state government in that region. And during the ethnography, there were certain areas that came out very strongly, and it was very distinct. Like the matchbox with which the fire is lit is an essential material for the Adivasis, while for the Oraons, preparing fire is readily available, the matchbox, the kerosene. For the Gonds, this is difficult. One anecdote, since I was not allowed to cook there in my informant's house, I would get up and clean the rice and cut the vegetables. In the morning, there was somebody talking about the PDS. I wish if somebody could actually see the rice that is being given out in the name of PTS. It has got a lot of worms. And I think when you clean 250 grams of rice, you will definitely find 50 or 70 grams of worms in the rice, just to add. And as I sat and did this, cleaning, cutting the vegetables, Akka would go to the house where smoke would come out from the thatched roof and a broken handrail, a tile, which we call kapda, would bring the burnt firewood from that house. This can be read in many ways: poverty, inability to buy matchboxes. However, if looked more profound, it also surfaces the whole idea of how community lives, or how community lives are connected, right from the morning fire to the working in each other's field, in preparing them for the seeds, to just sitting around cleaning the hair, the women, to pulling water from the well, to walking down the river, to washing the clothes, utensils. The Adivasis have lived for generations in the forest areas and mountains, not because they wanted to live there. Yes, history does prove how the Adivasis and the Dravidians were pushed away, while the Aryans made inroads in their habitation in the Indus Valley civilization and the Mohenjo-daro area. This is a fact which in today's contemporary arguments, it has been contested that the Aryans did not come from anywhere, but are the indigenous people of the country, which is utter trash and is not acceptable by any of the Adivasi community in this country. Rural India has its limitation in all aspects: food, transportation, moving from one area to another, quality education, which the government of India has initiated. We can also have another long session talking about what education and what quality education is being imparted to the Adivasis. Most of the forest and the rural areas of the country where most of the Adivasi community live have made this region their home for generations. And that is where the politics comes from. Generation after generation has been raised to respect and revere the trees, riverines, streams, hills, hillocks, mountains, spaces between two villages, spaces between two rivers, spaces between two forests. And everything in it is auspicious and sacred. The Gonds offer their gods and goddesses the first fruit before consuming it. The ritual situates the people by thanking the provider of all things for his or her benevolence. Even the little children are taught this right from the beginning. And I remember when Sarah and Manik were there in the field, they were also being trained that you don't eat the mango that has fallen, because that mango has to be offered to the goddesses who are there in just the nearby hill, and only after offering do we eat. The Urans, before consuming the Harya or the Arki, that Arki is the Mahwa liquor that is being made, drop a few drops on the mud floor, remembering their ancestors and the spirits who live around it. We don't believe in devils. The agricultural practices, which are seasonal, start in the month of May in all Adivasi communities. Preparing the agricultural field is a tedious process, especially when it is carried out in the months when the sun is at its hottest. Something that also needs to be mentioned, and since my fieldwork among the Dorlas and the Marias in Bijapur, and something that was a contemplation at that point of time was the event of the Beach for Doom, which takes place in the end of May, the beginning of June. And that is actually a cultural practice of distributing seeds to families who do not have them, or they have very little, which they cannot use, they cannot have it produced. And this practice among the Gonds has been a bone of contention and has led to violence and bloodshed, and the government of India and the state government does not take into consideration this ritual, this cultural ritual. This is the spirit of community and equality at its best, which the majoritarian culture does not and cannot understand, if even they do not want to understand. For the latter, consumption is a selfish business, whereas for the Adivasis, it is for all, with all. With the first rains in the month of June, plowing and preparation of the fields, planting the seeds in small pieces of land, transferring them to larger fields. Among the Gonds, the villagers participate in each other's field labor and help each other carry the seed to the field and sow the sapling. The Urans seek the help of other communities like the Lohars, the Mahators, the Dons, mostly the Dalit and the Pacific community who live in the vicinity of the village in return for daily wages. The Urals, slightly well off from the Gond counterpart, can use the moneyed transaction for their day-to-day life.
Hello, Alka.
Yeah.
Hello. Hello.
Like, so my next part is like where I have focused, like where I'm talking about gifting animal as a community value. So focusing on Assam, a central state in India's northeast, the second part of this paper explored the contestation of taste in food politics and its associated meaning within the fold of cultural identity. These contestations are further projected onto the discourse of culinary perception of mainland India and the difference between the two. The traditional food and its ethnic taste in the Northeast generally are perceived by the food enthusiasts in mainland India as jungly, unhealthy, unusual, and cheap. However, from the perspective of Northeastern, if I may say Northeastern, but that is also a very problematic term that I'm also trying to clarify in my paper. So these practices of rearing animals and worms, turning particular spices into food at the time of global warming, collecting food items from the forest or by the riverside, and these food tastes are something that forms their identity and originality bound to their culture. For the locals, not only do regional tastes correspondent to their age-old culinary tradition.
Hello. Hello.
Is Dona?
Sorry, carry on, Dona and Vani.
Okay.
There was just some disruption.
So yeah, so I'm saying here like how it is an age-old culinary tradition, which is the assertion that they are for a longer time they have done it to have it in their home as their knowledge system. They are now bringing it to the public places as a kind of assertion of the local food outside home, and the taste touches alter to the market to create a broader appeal. Thus, this work will set a range of further research into the problem of taste and identity in a culturally diverse nation state like India, where thousands of indigenous tastes are at the peril of assimilation into hegemonic taste. To understand how this hierarchy of food in the region and at the same time how in the whole state of India is been practiced in the name of vegetarian food and versus non-vegetarian food, but sometimes they don't they also don't understand how in the name of this distinction they are also they are also making the differences between non-vegetarian food and the food specially which is like fermented or which is like smelly. In that notion they are call it as stinky food or unhealthy food, and they are neglected throughout and through in and throughout in the state and the nation in the discourse of nation. So I remember I want to take bring one of my memories from the field visit when for the first time I was attending a meeting in women's organization there. It was an annual day celebration, and after the meeting that we were all invited for food, and there one of the participant asked me if I want to have food, and I said I wanted to understand why this question has been asked to me, and I said yes, but then it also it also took me to understand when in Assam, like then even the non-tribal, non-dominant families has stopped rearing pork, which used to be there for them as a business or as their own eating habit, but which has been reduced. But in case of where the tribal assertion is going, they have not stopped it. Rather, they have asserted it in a way, not only as a food, as a private means, as like privately practicing it, but they are asserting in the protest sites where they will have their own food stall, and especially by women who will be having this food stall, and they will be selling it. And behind that protest, they will also rear this pig for their own economical independence. So one may ask, like, if it has increased the visibility of tribal societies in public places, or is it the gender women or the gendered work that has been visible in the public space? So the contestation may be at different level, but what I understood that the practices of food or the varieties of food that is around pork, which is been called by in local term as uma, is very precious to them, and we have to really engage with how and why it is precious, which I'll be talking in my second part of my paper. Now again, back to Vani.
Donna and Vani, just to interrupt, you have 2-3 minutes remaining, so if
Okay.
you can bear that in mind. Thank you.
I would like to take up the drinking habits, or rather the drink, the haria and the mawa, the arki among the Oraos and the mawa, and the selfie among the Gons, and how this drink, which is food, has been looked down upon as bad and disgusting practice, which should be shunned and stopped. The whole preparation of haria and mawa is a very old traditional procedure, and it involves a lot of time. We are running short. We will stop somewhere. It is to be understood that the practice of drinking haria was to beat the heat when they would go to work in the fields during the months of paddy sowing and plowing, and they would carry it in their bottles too. While some of the men stated that the men consumed it before they could go to the fields if the food were not prepared. Eventually, it was replaced. Tea replaced it, and why haria is being served is like when relatives and extended family members come home during the day and it is hot. This drink is served so that at least the heat is being controlled instead of the cold water that we gulp it down from the fridge. The other food the non-timber forest produces, the minor forest produces, like change bhaji, putkal, the tamarind, the gongura leaves among the Gons, the morianga leaves. They are dried and they are eaten during seasons where there is no food, especially during the winter where there is no water, and the leaves are being plucked and dried during the summer so that they can be consumed. Now, all these food is food for the Adivasis. And when they are being asked to be replaced with paneer and replaced with dahi and replaced with doodh, milk, is something that the Adivasis consider it weird that the milk of the cow is meant for the calf, not for the human. So why do we even have to drink milk? Or why do we have to give our children the milk which is for the calf? While I would like to take up this aspect of the missionaries moving in the area, and well, while the Hindu communities living side by side with the Adivasis have always looked down at the food habits and looked down at the Adivasis in the practice of sanitizing and imposing the division of purity and pollution. The church also did what the Hindu community did to the Adivasis. So we will have to talk about that also critically.
This section where taste and identity has a spatial connection, where this cultural politics and food distinction of India's Northeast with spatial reference to Assam, where I'm also talking about the gender division of labor of cooking by women as everyday chores is not similar and cannot be placed under the precise understanding of a patriarchal society. No women in caste society are in the role of rearing animal, which can be the source of food or food itself. So it remained bound by the honor of four wall of kitchen and domestic life. But in contrast, there is also difference of cooked food and raw food. So in one case, the raw food of Northeast is been understood as very healthiest food because of its farming quality as organic food. But so I want to bring like why like this food and cooking goes hand in hand, not just as all women cooking is same, as cooking itself maintains strict dietary habit for caste in India to decide which food is holy and which food is not. And that has the capacity to become, holy food has the capacity to become from the holy women to become the prasadam, which is served to the god and goddesses. But unlike it, the food cooking cooked by the tribal food will not be holy ever for anybody. So in that way, like we cannot understand the gender division unless we understand the sources of the food, from where it is coming and who is rearing it, who is taking care of it. So even in the care division, even in the care notion to understand the labor, we have to actually go back there. So that's why I wanted, like in my last section, I say like the visibility of tribal culture in the region is also tribal women's visibility in the public life. So maybe, yeah, I'll conclude my paper here. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Dona and Vani, for an extremely ethnographically rich paper, and I'm sure there'll be a lot to discuss in the panel discussion. Right, moving straight along, we turn now to Priyanka Rajagopalan from zooming in from NYU, who will be presenting a paper called Chaat in the Closet, Queer Food Cultures in Southern India. Over to you, Priyanka.
Thank you, Dr. Froerer. Right. Good day to everyone. Thank you to everyone who can make it today. My name is Priyanka Rajagopalan. I'm a student in the Food Studies Master's Program at New York University Steinhardt, and today I will be presenting to you my paper, Chaat in the Closet, Queer Food Cultures in South India. Before I get into my presentation, I'd like to preface it by saying that the paper itself is a working paper and contains only preliminary research, but I plan on pursuing this research with dedication in future doctoral programs. When one mentions queerness in food, more often than not, the following image comes to mind: rainbow. Be it cake, croissants, or pasta, the common perception of queer food or queer food cultures tends to be limited to thoughts of food and drink and flamboyant food colorings. But what else does queerness have to do with food? Food and sexuality have always functioned as important parts of understanding human society, whether it is expressed in the form of gender roles in the kitchen, masculinization and feminization of food products, or analogies of food symbolism and desire. Food and queerness are intimately intertwined. Current scholarship around food studies in India revolves around food and identity, caste and religious politics that affect food and identity, and the changing food system. However, the intersection of food and queerness is rarely contended with. In my paper, I seek to highlight this inequality in the realm of Indian food studies research by arguing for the inherent and important link between queerness and food, thereby advocating for further dedicated research. So my presentation is organized by first presenting the existing research that I reviewed in terms of themes and literature and media, academic and non-academic alike. Then I will argue and analyze data gathered from the review and attempt to connect different perspectives of food and queerness by assessing different social factors and hypotheses on what is missing from these current research. Finally, I will conclude my presentation by advocating for the importance of queerness in food studies by outlining the potential paths of research and positioning queerness as an integral lens. With regards to existing research, Achari Anecdotes, Exploring Queer Food Cultures in Indian Kitchens, is an important ethnographic study conducted in 2022 by Anil Pradhan and Andronicus Aiden. The study surveyed a small sample of queer men in India and surveyed their experiences as queer men in the kitchen, a traditionally feminine space that they subvert. The study itself results in major themes that appear to revolve around the experiences of queer Indian men in the kitchen, including a refusal to cook out of fear of being feminized, the desire to learn cooking to establish a stronger sense of community and belonging, and the urge to validate one's social status by using food as performance. So important to note is that the study also acknowledges the lack of knowledge into queer food cultures in India, referring to the subject itself as terra incognita and existing only as underlying themes in existing research and not dedicated focuses. Nevertheless, themes drawn from Pradhan and Aiden's study are clearly latent in other literature regarding queerness and identity. Scholarly works such as Sexualities, edited by Nivedita Menon, and Histories of Desire, edited by Rajiv Kumarakamdat and Sanjeev Srivastava, dive into the complications of queerness in India and bring about questions of intersection of caste and queerness. For example, in the article Hijra, Intimacies and Inheritances by Brinda Bose, the connections between food symbolism and manifestation of queer futures for the Hijras, Tirunangai, or the transgender community of India is made. Similar themes are present in autobiographical works such as The Truth About Me by A. Revati, a transgender activist and writer. The article Invisible Men, Masculinity, Sexuality, and Male Domestic Labor by Radhika Chopra details the simultaneous visibility and suppression of masculine identity in Indian domestic workers, especially workers who work within the kitchen. These themes are clear evidence of a link between queerness and food that is yet to be researched. When it comes to media, even though there is a distinct lack of peer-reviewed work in queer food cultures in India, social media platforms and performance media serve as places for discourse and communication. Instagram and Twitter in particular serve as platforms for activists and artists who aim to change the narrative around food identity in India through performance art, poetry, and charity events. For example, theater artists like Sri Vamsi Matta, pictured on the slide, aim to abolish the stigma surrounding purity and caste that surrounds food politics in India. Through storytelling and communal eating, he seeks to reestablish eating as a human experience rather than one dictated by caste. Instagram users such as Ankur Gedam, known by his Instagram handle Dalit Vegan, and the Big Fat Bao, who remains anonymous, write and critique from this point of view as well. Both are members of the queer community, yet use different approaches to tackle caste discrimination in food politics in India. While both are implicated in queerness as a result of their proponents' perspective, their modes of research widely diverge and is worthy of further research. So what is the potential of this research and the question that I am asking? How do we understand queerness in India? Having summarized existing research in queer food cultures in India, I now aim to position the complexity and complicated nature of queerness in an Indian subcontext. What does it mean to be queer? As posited by Michel Foucault and echoed by R. Raj Rao, queerness is not limited to one's sexual preference and identity, but extends to how one uses their sexuality to differently interpret society around them. To queer food cultures in India would not be to only understand sexuality in food, but to understand how the relationship between sexuality and food has a fundamental impact on existing power structures, subverts class hierarchies, and perceives dominant ways of thinking. So it is crucial to note that queer theory as we know it was not developed with the diverse population of India in mind. So how do we contend with notions of westernization and modernization that plague current queer discourse in India as it continues to be problematized by unique social markers such as caste and religion? How do pre-colonial queer identities like the Tirunangai or the transgender community in India play a role in food cultures, even as the Anglophone population of the upper class adopts queer vocabulary from the Western world, such as genderqueer and non-binary? I argue that it would be useful to utilize theoretical arguments of Indian academics such as Sundar Sarkar and Gopal Guru, writers of the book The Cracked Mirror, an Indian debate on theory and experience. The book, which wrestles with the pitfalls of theorizing and the importance of experience in understanding Indian social theory, draws from both Indian and Western ways of thinking that could potentially help build a framework to understand queer food cultures in India by positioning caste as a major social marker. As chronicled in current news, the legitimacy of queerness and queer relationships is still legally contested in the Indian subcontext. As of 2018, Article 377 that criminalized homosexual relationships has been abolished, but the battle for legal marriage rights for queer couples is still ongoing today. Queer couples and families are prohibited from marrying legally, which comes with the economic implications of not being able to have joint bank accounts and the social implications of not being able to jointly parent adopted children. These questions as to how state regulation affects food procurement and budgeting is yet to be studied and could be a potential path of inquiry. In a similar vein, decriminalization of homosexual acts in India also affects MSM, or men who have sex with men. These are men who have homosexual sex, yet reject the label of queerness and homosexuality as part of their identity. This phenomenon may prove to be very important in queer food studies. An example is the article Just Queer Folks, written by Colin R. Johnson, who through his research showed that homosexual relations were common in migrant farm laborers during the Great Depression in rural America. Given India's high population of agrarian farm workers and migrant laborers, this phenomenon could definitely be an occurrence in India and is worth looking into. To conclude, so why is queer food culture important? What does queerness have to do with the food that we cook, eat, and produce? As I have shown in my presentation, queer identities and experiences shape the world differently and create unique narratives that have far-reaching effects in society. Queerness is built into food systems and is integral to it. Transcending the fundamental ideas of what queerness means also helps open up valuable paths of inquiry into understanding our food systems and its different participants and stakeholders. So I'd like to conclude my presentation with a quote from Michelin-starred chef, Indian chef Surbi Sani of Tagmo and NYC. When asked what her queerness had to do with her food and her ability as a chef, she said, "It's part of who I am as a human being, and I bring that to the table. But being queer is not just about my sexuality. For me, it is being inclusive and having a space where anyone and everyone is welcome." Thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to acknowledge that I have a lot of deep gratitude to my professor and mentor, Mark Chatterpal, for his invaluable mentorship and guidance in my research. I want to thank my peers and colleagues Stella Tatino, Shrishti Sensarma, Sophia Jimenez, and Shrish Vijaya Sudarshan for their constant feedback during my writing process. And lastly, but not least, but I am grateful to the queer communities of India whose knowledge and experiences made this paper possible. These are my references, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Priyanka, for another very rich. Thank you very much, Priyanka, for another very rich and provocative paper, which will surely get some interesting discussion after the conclusion of the papers here. Let's turn now to our third paper from Aditi Kumar, who will be presenting on fermented foodways, a gendered exploration of fermented food preparation processes in and around Guwahati. And Aditi is zooming in from Ambedkar University in Delhi. Over to you, Aditi.
Yeah, hi everyone. Let me quickly share my screen. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. I hope I'm audible and visible, and I hope my screen is visible as well.
Yes, all good.
All right, thank you. Hi everyone once again, and first I'd like to take this opportunity to quickly thank the organizers and chairs for this wonderful opportunity. I'm truly grateful to be a part of this workshop and this incredibly brilliant panels and such rich and engaging discussions. So the title of my paper is Fermented Foodways, a gendered exploration of fermented food preparation processes in and around Guwahati. So this is the main agenda of the whole paper. I'll quickly move on to the aim of the research. So the aim of the study is to basically understand fermented foodways through a gendered lens. Now, the term foodways is inclusive of a vast array of aspects, including food production, preparation, movement of food, consumption, etc. In this paper, however, I just focus on the gender dimension of the whole process, starting from gathering of the raw materials to carrying out the fermentation process before making the final produce available in the markets and available for consumption. So to be more clear and precise, I would like to put my aim like this. So through an ethnographic fieldwork, my study has engaged in a gendered exploration of food fermentation processes in Guwahati, as well as mostly in the neighboring regions where the fermentation processes mostly takes place. The fermented food preparation process also interested me because it was distinct from other food production processes, as it did not take place in industrial settings. It took place in kitchens, in the domestic spaces, and with the help of family or community members. So before I move on to what encouraged me to take up this topic and the background and methodology, I want to begin with an anecdote drawn from my personal encounter with fermented food, encounter as well as experience. So there are a variety of fermented food consumed in the Northeast as well as in Assam, the state where Guwahati is located. But my earliest memory of fermented food is of having khorisa, the Assamese term for fermented bamboo shoot pickle that we used to buy every time we visited Meghalaya, or even from the weekly huts and stores selling indigenous food items across Guwahati. Besides fermented bamboo shoot, I remember hearing stories from my paternal grandmother a lot about fermented rice, which we call in Assamese poita bhat. She would reminisce how she used to prepare the rice for fermenting at night and have it as breakfast in the morning, and that would drastically reduce her morning labor of cooking a variety of food items for breakfast. So today, the unique flavor and scent of fermented food, as well as conversations around it, evokes a memory of childhood. But a thing is that when something becomes a part of our ordinary everyday, we usually overlook the underlying socio-political meanings embedded in the mundane items. Khorisa or fermented fish, for example, a mundane food item became a mundane food item in our lives and a perfect flavor to accompany our meals. It was only when I moved to Delhi to pursue my higher studies, I had an interesting encounter with fermented food again that made me reflect on the social, political, and cultural aspects of the everyday acts of producing, preparing, and consuming fermented food. Several of us who had migrated from the northeastern states brought with us bottles of fermented bamboo shoot. Food is one of the reasons due to which northeasterns face northeasterns face racism and dietary policing. The Northeast term again is flawed, which I'm going to reflect on in a while, and also I'm going to reflect on the racism they face because of food and dietary practices. At the same time, fermented food is also shared and gifted to one another. Dishes prepared from fermentation are relished in dinner parties and special occasions. Hence, the most mundane acts of acquiring, eating, and sharing fermented food became a repository of memory, a sense of belongingness, a reminder of home, one's roots, and a site of assertion of dietary rights, as well as resisting racism. So now moving on to the rationale, the main concerns that motivated the theme of this research. First was the importance of fermented food in a dietary culture of people belonging to the northeastern and eastern Himalayan communities in India. Exploring the gender dimension of the fermentation process would help us understand it as a site where social relationships, indigenous knowledge, patriarchy, ethnic identity, etc. are entangled. Also, another concern was after engaging with the scholarship around the larger political and social aspects embedded in consumption practices, I felt that it would be important to examine the social and political connotations embedded in the acts preceding the consumption, including acquiring the raw materials, preparation, and fermentation in this case, and bringing it to the markets or making it ready for consumption. So in simpler words, along with understanding the political meanings and messages underlying the consumption of fermented food, I wanted to explore who ferments the food, the site of preparation, where do the raw produce come from, who forages the bamboo shoot and other raw products. So one second. So now before I move on, 1 minute. So now a little bit of background of the region where my research is located. And Guwahati is located in Assam, which is one of the 8 states of Northeast India. So Northeast India is a collective, directional and flawed term referring to the eastern frontier region of India. It consists of 8 states and a vast international border surrounding it. I have pasted a map on the side just for reference. And a significant diversity of language, culture, and ethnicity across different communities living in the region. The region consists of a vast and diverse scheduled tribe population who form a majority of the population in 4 out of the 8 states, and non-tribal communities as well. So the problem with the terminology Northeast is that one of the problem is that it undermines the diversity. The collective term undermines the diversity across communities across the 8 states in the region. The region shares a complex and hierarchical relationship with the Indian nation state, with history of armed conflict and violent suppression from the Indian state to extrajudicial killings and militarization. People from the region have been marginalized, racialized, and discriminated against in the rest of India for their distinct looks and way of life. Now, food and dietary practices is a part of people's way of life, which in this case becomes a medium through which they are subjected to discrimination and racism in rest of India. As scholar and author Dr. Dolly Kikon says, everyday consumption practices builds new stereotypes and prejudices and produces questions around citizenship and belongingness. In the dominant Indian dietary landscape, fermented food from the Northeast is pushed to the margins and is referred to as smelly or dirty and treated as the culinary other. In such a case, preparing and consuming food that is located in the periphery of the culinary order becomes a site of resistance and assertion of dietary rights. Now, a little bit background of about food fermentation. Food fermentation is also a food preservation method, so it played an important role of food security during the times of food shortages. And fermented food that I came across in my research includes a range of items like fermented bamboo shoot, fermented soybean or akhuni, fermented dried fish, items made out of fermented mustard. But this is not exhaustive. The list is not exhaustive at all. And an important thing to note here is that fermented food also has an olfactory dimension. The unique scent is a comfort to many, a smell which invokes the memory of the familiar, memory of community and home, while others, mostly non-eaters, might find the smell revolting. Now, important part of my research, which I want to reflect, is why Guwahati? Why did I choose Guwahati as a research site? So, because of various reasons. Firstly, I have lived in the city all my life. I wanted to navigate the fermented foodways of the various fermented food items that form an integral part of the dietary landscape of the city. Exploring the fermentation processes, the fermenters' narratives, and the movement of the food from the site of preparation to the site where it is made available to be purchased and consumed would not just reflect on the gendered labor, but also a changing dietary landscape and patterns of food preparation and consumption in the city. Now, this is the existing scholarship that I drew from and I engaged with. I want to note that scholar and writer Dolly Kifon's work on food fermentation and Northeast forms an integral part of the existing scholarship, from which I have been inspired as well. Coming across her work and reading it opened my eyes to the fact that preparing and consuming fermented food goes beyond the dietary dimension, and it carries meanings that reflects aspects of social, political, and cultural reality of the society, and the other literature I have listed in this slide. So now the methodology that I used is ethnographic fieldwork, which included the methods of open-ended interview and participant observation. Here I have listed the research sites, which I call Fermented Food Map of Guwahati, which includes 2 weekly markets or huts and 2 ethnic restaurants, and one of them was a women-led initiative specializing in Boro and Naga cuisine, few ethnic stores selling fermented food, and also homes and kitchens of family members and relatives who still carry out fermentation processes and occasionally buys it from the market. Although carrying out the fermentation process by themselves has drastically reduced in urban households. So now to the main part.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. You have just 2 more minutes, so if you could kind of jump straight to your concluding comments. Thank you.
All right. So the main part of my analysis is that after I did a gendered exploration of the fermentation process, I found the main finding was about gendered labor. Fermentation process is predominantly carried out by women. Everyday food preparation process in this case becomes a site of gendered power relations. So the next one, I will quickly jump onto the next finding, which is about women and indigenous knowledge system in food culture. The responsibility of carrying, preserving, and intergenerational transfer of traditional knowledge of indigenous foodways is singularly handed to the women in this case. However, they have been never acknowledged enough for their role in ensuring the survival of food culture and dietary practices. When I was doing the research, they explained to me in detail about the fermentation process of bamboo shoot, which I have written here, but I'll not go into it. And the third finding is about fermentation spaces. And these are sites of fostering community and friendships. Fermentation sites are mostly kitchens. In homes, the process is often carried out individually in groups of 2 or 3 women. These sites become also one important thing that I found out was the women who come to the huts also said that preparation of fermented food was a small scale family or community affair. They would sit together at one corner of the marketplace and bond over conversation and laughter, share woes and joys while they go on with their daily routine of interacting and selling things to the customers. Now, I want to point out that my paper has a significant amount of limitation as well, because this research is only a small part of the analysis of a larger research that I am still in the process of carrying out. So it's a work in progress. And with the vastness of my research site and diversity in fermentation processes that exist, I'm still in the process of interacting with more people, understanding the underlying dimensions, as well as reading and engaging more with the existing scholarship. And lastly, I have also mentioned the connected themes and areas where more research could be done. And And these are the ones that's listed here. And finally, I want to conclude by, I'd like to conclude my paper by stating the complex site that fermentation is. It is a contested site of gendered socialization and burden on one hand, and as my respondents had stated, an empowering process on the other, in the sense that it was a site where they could assert their valuable knowledge, which was responsible for ensuring the survival of indigenous foodways. So here I want to conclude my paper.
Thank you very much, Aditi. That's great. And we can get back to this paper in the discussion. Final paper in this panel, we now turn to Regina Hansda from University of Edinburgh, who will be speaking on Indigenous food and insurgent spaces of nostalgia, solidarity, and reclamation in Jharkhand and Meghalaya. Over to you, Regina.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, all clear.
Okay. Okay, great. Great. Thank you so much for organizing this conference, and James for bearing with me. I submitted my paper very late, and I just couldn't miss this opportunity of being a part of this community, this food community. And this is still a working title. I'm still not sure if the word insurgent should be there, but we'll figure this out. And so in this paper, I consider 2 case studies of indigenous food, a restaurant cafe in India, one which is named as Ajam Emba in Jharkhand, and the other one, May Ramu Cafe in Meghalaya. Each of these spaces, similar and different in some ways and embedded in the local, regional, and global food politics, are indicative of the current food and agriculture practices, the place of indigenous people in such narrative, and the struggles of food justice. Drawing from interviews, participant observation, and survey, very brief one, and using interpretive phenomenology, I argue that in explicit sense, these may be sites of nostalgia, memory, or experiencing the authentic local tribal food, but these spatial food practices constitute infra-politics that is creating new narratives and which is counter-hegemonic in nature. So I'll start with this quote, which really resonated with me. This is an Adivasi student from Jharkhand. She says, in my interview with her during my undergraduate days in Kolkata, one of the teachers asked us to share about the popular food from our state. Most of the students had something to share about the cuisine, even though we were 7 of us, Adivasis in that class, all from Jharkhand, but none of us could gather enough courage to say anything about the food. Later after the class, we discussed amongst ourselves that we could have said Duska. It was a brief discussion and we never talked about it again. Now, Anna name changed. Sorry, I've written Anna, Adivasi student, is in her 20s, and she recalls how that incident and their collective inability to articulate and share about the food culture with the non-Adivasis has stuck with her. She had a lump in her throat when she said, Annie couldn't quite place the exact reasons that restrained her from sharing about a food with her teacher and classmates, but she thinks it was a combination of hesitation and fear of being mocked at, of trying to explain a weird-sounding word like Duska. I saw a resonance of how Annie felt with my own childhood memories. I grew up in a small town in erstwhile Bihar, now Jharkhand. I'm from the Santhal tribe, in a place called Madhupur. And then later in middle school, in a relatively larger town, we moved to West Bengal in Asansol and lived in a railway colony where we were the only Adivasis in the neighborhood. Our situation was that of the Adivasi family in Gujarat. As Hansda Savindra Shekhar wrote in his novel, the Adivasi will not dance. But it was slightly better, as we didn't completely give up on our food. Any beef or pork we ate, it was courtesy some friend or distant relative who would cook and bring for us. Chusta, which is basically the organ meat of goat or chicken intestines, was the closest we could eat more frequently. But the day of such eating would entail so much of preparation, locking the main door, which is something unusual in small towns, opening the windows to get the smell out of the room, hiding food in the furthest corner of the room if somebody did knock the door. The questions that emerge from this is why Annie and her friends couldn't share about their food culture like their peers in the class. Why were we so gripped with fear and shame for just eating our own food? Rather, why could we not share our food so easily as non-Adivasis? And here I'm especially referring to upper caste Hindus in our neighborhood. What conditions shaped that shame, the fear, the disavowal and negation of self and of one's food, culture, and identity? And why does, and here I ask this question, why does all the regional thalis, example, Bengali thali, South Indian thali, Rajasthani thali, amongst others, where there are significant Adivasi population in the states, have no representation of their food in the platter? Why most of the thalis, barring few exceptions, serve only vegetarian food? Now, this pushes us to consider the question, what constitutes indigenous food? Is there a clear distinction between indigenous and non-indigenous food? And what does it mean to assert and claim one's food culture in the current political economic conjuncture? Sorry. For the purpose of this presentation, I consider indigenous food as plant and animal-based foods from both cultivated and non-cultivated source. The non-cultivated is central here, and it essentially connotes to harvesting food from the forests that are naturally existing and are produced in specific locations and are informed by traditional knowledge in harvesting, processing, and cooking techniques. And many of the presentations earlier to me have mentioned in different ways. Now, to understand this, we need to go back a little bit on the history and the political economy of food. The colonial construction of, the social construction of indigenous cultures during colonial times defined people like us as primitive, uncivilized, and inferior in relation to the colonizers. And this got continued in the post-colonial period. In the post-colonial, it was reproduced in contemporary food systems. Example, the Green Revolution, which privileged certain knowledge systems and practices, and especially shifting cultivation practices was demonized. And in certain states, there were deliberate attempts to move and empty out lands. In other places, they couldn't. And the places where they couldn't are especially areas which fell into sixth scheduled areas. And in the post-colonial period, there was an added disadvantage of the caste system and the Brahminical concept of purity and pollution, which also extended to food. Where white, fine-looking grains, rice, wheat, over dark, coarse grains, millets, disadvantage production and consumption, and this kind of paradigm essentially disadvantaged the marginalized groups, mainly Adivasis and the Dalits. Now, let's zoom out a little bit. India, as most of you must be knowing, is very big on the right to food debate and has been one of the key developing countries who have managed to stall the Doha rounds of negotiations, and it hasn't picked up from since. And the key argument of the government has been that the individual countries should have the autonomy and the right to ensure food security of all its citizens before having to export food grains in the international market as per the WTO trade agreement. Through these assertions, India, along with other developing countries, certainly has tilted the global power relations on the questions of food. But what kind of food security India was arguing about? As we can see from the bottom image, it's basically to be able to supply surplus rice and wheat generated in the Green Revolution belt, which is Punjab, Haryana, Western Uttar Pradesh, to supply to the public distribution system. And very recently, we saw in the farmers' protest of 2021 that these were the regions which were sold to us as benefiting from agriculture, that the the scene is not that great. The women holding those photos are essentially have lost kith and kin from their own family. Now, coming back to what my research was about, it was a short exploratory research, less than 3 months of field work. I'm so envious of the PhD students of being able to do ethnography, and that's a luxury at this stage now that I'm working. So the main aim was to understand history and politics of food that have shaped the conditions for erasures of indigenous peoples' food culture, and explore and understand the everyday resistance and how indigenous people are reclaiming their food base. The sites I've taken Ajamemba in Jharkhand and Meeramu Cafe in Meghalaya. I have used interpretive phenomenology as the methodological approach, where I privilege the lived subjective experiences of specific individuals, mostly Adivasis and tribals, in specific contexts for this analysis. I have a long-standing interest in questions of food and agriculture. My food PhD was on gender dimensions of sustainable smallholder agriculture in Bihar. So I have also interpreted some of these insights with my own lived experience as a Santhal Adivasi woman. In doing so, I've tried to make sense of how each of my respondents, including myself, have interpreted those experiences, and therefore it draws on both descriptive and hermeneutic phenomenology to identify meanings. Now,
Regina, just to interrupt one more thing, you just have 5 minutes to kind of get to the heart of and conclude your discussion.
Okay. So I was very lucky to be a part of this inauguration of Meeramu Cafe in Ribhoy. And so this inauguration, and as you can see, literally the whole village was there. It's a small village and you can't miss the dog. So this was also I was able to attend the Farmers Weekly Market, and the main narratives of the people who had come, who were mostly middle class, working men and women, and they're coming to seek ingredients whereby they could recreate some of the traditional recipes. Now, talking about Ajamemba, as you can see, Aruna, through her, in her restaurant, is using the discarded coarse dark ingredient to create and present, food, and she does it with great pride. And so I'm not going to go into the detail. I'll be happy to answer. So coming to the core of my findings, I mean, this core, अपने लोग अपना खाना एक अच्छे से जगह में ये एहसास कभी नहीं मिला मुझे. And the quote sums up how Adivasis have eaten food. Sorry, I'm feeling a little rushed. So this kind of ontological comfort, it's a rarity for most, Adivasi people. And this is where I draw from W.E. Du Bois, where he talks about double consciousness, where, our understanding of the self is based on the understanding of how others view. And this, as a result, kind of creates a multiple levels of identity crisis. So a place like this, where the material culture is familiar to the people, the taste, the texture, and being surrounded by loads of Adivasi people, it's kind of gives an ontological comfort. I use Giddens, who points out Giddens' term of ontological security, who says that seemingly ordinary activities like eating food can provide people with ontological security. I've used the term comfort just to indicate an affective dimensions of food eating. And it is an ontological comfort. If you're there, please do go and eat. And the second main finding is places like this are sites of infrapolitics. With intrapolitics, I'm drawing upon James Scott, who says that in his book on Weapons of the Weak, and domination and the arts of resistance, that there are ordinary people who've been on the margins use very subtle and covert forms of everyday resistance to assert their point of view. And Aruna, for instance, refused to serve vegetarian meal when she was asked to serve on Gandhi Jayanti. It's completely defeats the purpose. Both Ajamemba and Mehrmove Cafe serve food from items harvested from both cultivated and non-cultivated source. In the case of Meghalaya and most of the parts of Northeast, it's jhum cultivation. And in the case of, say, Central Plainland, it's forest. And whereby there is that assertion of right that Adivasi people have a historical relationship with forest, and in doing so, even though the forest department would find different ways to, prevent collection of NTFPs, but in doing so, there is an assertion. And I just would like to use this quote, which was articulated, said to me during Ribhoy. It's like many agriculture extension officials visit our village and want to train us on new modern varieties of seeds. We listen to them, but we also use our discretion whether to sow or not, and how much and what type of land. And this is where it is about, how much of land, so that it would, the officials keep coming to the village because they're also dependent on government seeds, and they know policies are made for the people. And this is a village which is many villages in and around Meghalaya are quite conscious of the food culture and assert, and but also conscious that it is also assert that the government needs to work for them and schemes and policies. And so in conclusion, there is change in continuity. We saw, like Momo, the popular street food, has been presented as Marwa Momo. People who were on the margins never had culture. Now Adivasis, indigenous people's food culture is becoming, it's the superfood, is the new superfood, and there is growing health consciousness. Millet, for instance, has the lowest glycemic index, so it's very popular for people with diabetes and other coronary artery diseases. So it's been massively promoted by governments. Like this year is the UN Year of Millets, and it's no surprise why different governments are promoting. But here I kind of want to articulate there's a danger of appropriation. One would find many restaurants now serving common food using millet, which is great, but it's quite a laborious process. And it's like what kind of lands are producing and what kind of people and whose bodies and whose labor are used to produce this. I was in this conference, Indigenous Food Concert, and I was speaking to this, Kont Young. He was a youth person. I was asking, how do you feel about this Orissa Millet Mission, and it's catching so much, it's being inspiration for other states to follow. And that's when he says कि सरकार मंडिया की खेती सिखा सकती है, क्या इससे संबंधित कल्चर के बारे में बता सकती है? Essentially talking about, you can teach about farming, but where is the part of culture within agriculture? Can they teach? So I would just kind of, with the last line, that for the non-Adivasis, millet might be a superfood, but for the Adivasis, and here I include Dalits as well, it is a heritage food. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regina. That was so interesting. Really, really, really good presentation. Right. I am now going to sort of draw this panel back together again. And first to thank all of you, all of our panel speakers, for bringing such rich ethnographic nuance and reflection to this discussion on resistance and marginality. And some really interesting material, some really interesting discussion. and lots of it that kind of links to each other. I think in particular, I noticed a lot of connections between each of these 4 papers, and I want to sort of draw some connections in this sort of reflection statement here. As is the pattern, I will first highlight some of the common themes I think that have emerged before framing a more general question, which I would like to invite each of the panel members to respond to before I'll then open up the questions to others. So just to start, one of the features I thought that struck me in the course of each presentation was the importance of gender, whether cultivating or fermenting, preparing or serving food, or preserving traditional forms of knowledge for intergenerational transfer. Such activities reminded us of the vital role that gender and sexuality has played in shaping and protecting food cultures and heritages, and the practices, performances, and discourses surrounding them. So, of course, gender and sexuality is something that is infused in all of the discussions that we've just heard. In each discussion, moreover, we were treated to the ways in which food comes to stand for more than just a source of sustenance, something to be cultivated for the purpose of consumption. Food, we have learned, is also a repository for historical and social memory. It represents community roots and rights, and serves to connect disparate peoples and communities to both past and present forms of belonging and representation and resistance. At the center of all of these 4 papers, finally, was the privileging of peripheral, marginalized identities in relation to existing power structures and hierarchies and inequalities of food practices and preferences, but also inequalities of cultures and indeed inequalities of history. Now, such inequalities and other distinctions were articulated in opposition to an increasingly dominant culinary regime. Food, in short, is fundamentally political. We certainly heard a lot about that in these 4 papers. It serves as a form of resistance, an assertion of identity and rights against mainland or majoritarian Indian taste, against conventional modes of thinking, against existing power structures and class hierarchies, against the culinary other, against, in other words, those hegemonic food regimes that dominate food cultures across India and other parts of South Asia. This then begs the question that I want to get to. How are we to understand these dominant hegemonic food regimes that are being resisted by marginalized communities? What are we referring to exactly? There's a danger, I feel, that ideas and broader discourses around so-called mainland majoritarian conventional cultures and practices that underpin these so-called hegemonic food regimes are themselves being reified. So here I then pitch back to the members of this panel. Could each of you comment very, very briefly, and I stress briefly, please, on how these hegemonic food regimes are to be defined, understood, or represented in the context of your sort of ethnographic and analytical setting? Is there a precise line delineating what constitutes mainstream, majoritarian, or conventional Indian tastes or practices on the one hand, with a more socially and spatially peripheral foodways on the other? So again, this is the kind of key question I wish to pitch to each of the 4 panel members here. If you could comment very briefly on how you might define or unpack this notion of the hegemonic food regime to which your material is speaking. Now, I have some other paper-specific questions that I might return to later. But for now, again, I would just like each of you in turn to try and address this question around this hegemonic food regime before I open up to other questioners. So to kick us off, I'm going to return to the order of the papers. I'm going to ask Dona and Vani to reflect first on this question. Again, please keep your comments brief so that we can have a good general discussion. Over to you, Dona and Vani. Just maybe a couple of minutes maximum, please.
So to begin with, so my scale or my lens, which I took from my field, is that something like beach. So the notion on their food, like the notion of pollution, which has been in some way given to them or in some way put into them. And I understood it comes from caste as much as could have been or would have come from the colonial understanding of uncivilized food. So I think I have understood that hegemonic food regime which has existed in India till now to the tribal community in Assam, because this kind of racial discrimination that the tribal faced even within Assam, maybe from whatever community, like sometime also from the non-dominant community, not directly, but when they changes their food habit, as I come from non-tribal, non-dominant community. So even when my family's culture shift because of Hinduization at some process or because of the present government regime, when the pure food or the vegetarianism is been practicing, it's coming for a longer time now, how it affects them and how, so in that way, I am understanding the Majoritarian food, which it implies on certain community. Yeah.
Thanks very much,
And
Dona.
and I understand not everybody is in the same ladder. So we have to distinguish, like, okay.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a very good point. Thank you very much. Priyanka, let's turn to you. How might you address this question?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's an excellent one, makes me really think. So to answer your question about how like food regime works like within constraints of my paper, I think about it a lot in terms of like knowledge in terms of like cooking and who gets to control food. So that kind of like gender hegemony that can be subverted through like queerness. So if we take queerness itself to mean like to trouble or to subvert, so that notion of queer theory, when you incorporate into like these food regimes and like the concept of the hegemony itself, I think is like very useful in understanding like the dynamic relations of food. For example, in the study that I mentioned, Achari Anecdotes, the researchers talk about how queer men either choose to engage with or choose to actively resist the art of cooking because they think it is a traditionally feminine space. But this is, again, like a hegemonic ideal. It is a traditional norm that only women are meant to enter the kitchen, and it's a very feminine space. So I think this was one of the big hegemonies that I grappled with in my paper.
Good and interesting, really interesting. Thanks, Priyanka. Aditi, over to you.
Thank you for the question. When I think about hegemonic food regimes as opposed to peripheral dietary landscape, what comes to my mind is any kind of food regime that that hegemonizes for example, when I was in this is a recurrent occurrence in Delhi and in most metropolitan cities in rest of India. Northeastern communities and the food that they have mostly fermented food, since my research was on that as well. They are often asked by the neighbors who are not from the Northeast or not familiar with fermented food or non-tribal communities, and they would marginalize the fermented food as smelly or stinky or dirty food, and they would ask the people who eat it to not to cook it. Or, for example, a very good example of hegemonic regimes of food, I think, comes from the example that in a few years back, I don't remember the exact year, Delhi police actually brought out a handbook which asked Northeastern people from migrants from the Northeast to not cook fermented food because of its smell. And so when certain food is pushed in the margins, and and as Dona had said, even within Assam, we could see this interplay of hegemonic food and peripheral food, because between the difference and the interaction of the dominant food practices, which the dominant food practices, which is which is practiced by the non-tribal communities, and the food practices of the tribal communities. So in that way, I think it can be understood, hegemonic food regimes can be understood.
Good, interesting. Thank you very much, Aditi. Finally, Regina, would you like to comment on this question briefly?
Yeah. So, I mean, when thinking from the dominant food regime, there are two broad demarcations. One, of course, as I mentioned, one of my slides, it's about the Green Revolution in the post-colonial period, which created a certain kind of narrative of which food is desirable and how every land should aspire for that kind of crop, whether it's suitable for your land or not. So even rain-fed area is trying to cultivate highly water-intensive crops, and farmers getting into debt relations. And second, about this hegemonic regime around food is post-globalization, where many modern foods have, I mean, in Ranchi and in Shillong, these two states are very different in terms of how they govern themselves. Meghalaya is under sixth schedule, so there is greater autonomy and control, and many of the leaders are, indigenous people themselves, and of course the village tribal chiefs. And in the case of say Jharkhand, it's governed by the North Indian politics basically, and amongst the price of modernity that some of us have experienced is loss of a language, loss of a food culture, and loss of that conversation of our heritage. And so it's only in the recent times, post, I would say, conversations of food sovereignty by Lavia Campesina, like both my, both the sides, Aruna Tirki and in Meremu Cafe, Neswas, basically, they've all been part of, Slow Food Internationals, and they're aware of the discourse, and they're creating that narrative and discourse of continually engaging while also resisting, by also getting subsumed in that power relationship. So there is a struggle, and like I'm very interested. It's like, suppose if I were to cook, where would I get the ingredients? Where would I get the millet? So that political economy of food and its availability for me to be able to practice my own food culture.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Regina. This discussion just reminds us, I think, that how notions of hegemony and hegemonic kind of ideas of a hegemonic food regime are themselves extremely heterogeneous and require quite nuanced and quite contextualized sort of approach in trying to understand what we mean by these in order to kind of avoid reifying, what we're trying to critique. So thank you so much. Really interesting responses. For now, I'm going to turn to some of the questions in YouTube, and just a reminder to all participants, both here on Zoom and our YouTube live stream channel. Please, if you have any questions, put them in the chat, and we will try and get to as many as possible. We're slightly over going over length here, so I'm going to just limit this last sort of question period to just under 10 minutes, and we'll slightly delay our tea break. Again, if you could keep your responses concise and succinct, I would be very, very grateful. A brief question first to Dona and Vani from Shmuel Yerushalmi. How is traditional food supported? It's not clear how is traditional food supported, or how has traditional food supported development in post-colonial societies, in post-colonial countries? That's a very, very big question, but if you have any insight, how does traditional food, and you can expand that, practices, traditions supported post-development or supported development in post-colonial societies? So quick response to that, if possible, Dona and Vani, before I read the next question. Oh, you're on mute, Dona, I'm afraid.
So can you please repeat the question so that Vani can address it?
What is that question trying to?
So again, the question, how does traditional food, or how is traditional food supported, or how has, I guess there are two ways to think about this question, how has traditional food supported development in post-colonial society, in post-colonial India? So perhaps think of it in that respect.
We are talking about development and the development models. I can probably put the question back asking, what sort of development model are we talking about? And the traditional food that the community has been having, supporting themselves at large in different areas of the country. For them, that is their food, and they don't have to follow the development models that have been imposed on them. And I think the community still insists that we would continue to eat what is available. And the larger question is also coming up is the capitalism that is being pushed into the Adivasi community everywhere in the country, and how the food at their table, at their fireplace is being replaced by the larger food that the development in quotes would like to see them having, instead of the rice and the water that we have in the morning, means the basi baat. Let's have, why not we have bread instead? So the people, the community would still keep on sticking to the basi bhat. So
Yeah, if I can add, I mean, this also comes from cheap food, the food which is available, in case of vegetable, bark of the tree would be food, root of the tree would be food, even the leaf, fruits, flowers, everything would be food. But for from the developmental side, only the fruits would be the food. So this is how traditional food has its own kind of charm.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. Interesting food for thought there. There are now two questions for Priyanka. I'm going to just read both of them, and Priyanka, you can choose how to answer them. First question from Amanda Lanzillo, who is especially interested in the intersections of class and queerness and the way queer identities are or are not picked up by people across class and caste divides. Let's see, does food and eating together ever, oh dear, I've lost the question here. Does food and eating together, let me see if I can pick this up, ever provide space for overcoming these divides, or does it recreate them? So that's question one. A second question from Merle Hansen. You mentioned how difficult consolidating diverse queer food cultures is. How do you view digital services and platforms to not cater and construct it? So those are two questions for you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. That's a really great question. So to answer the first question on if food and eating together, and I suppose commensality, does it provide a space together where caste and class barriers can be overcome, and then queerness as a whole can just be more integrated? I think there definitely is that act of commensality that helps in establishing a sense of community, a sense of belonging, and a sense of collective identity. For example, the performance theater artist that I talked about in my paper, Sri Vamsimata, he has a performance piece called Come Eat With Me, where he engages in communal storytelling, both by him and by people in the audience. And this is open to people of all castes, all ages, all classes. There are no barriers. Of course, there is also an entry fee, which does indicate some sort of class barrier that has to be crossed. But as having attended one of those events, I would say that this kind of space offers a kind of like a sense of community that just really helps in understanding like queerness, and also in terms of like caste and class divides, which can be overcome through the act of food, because participants are also encouraged to bring their own food, like share their memories of food. And I think this is how these barriers are definitely crossed, through the act of like commensality and eating and common spaces. To answer the second question, so I believe that was, it's really difficult to consolidate diverse queer food cultures, and digital services and platforms today, I think, are very powerful in kind of consolidating them, because they provide this kind of, again, relatively very accessible space for people of all backgrounds to come and engage with and talk about queerness. For example, the Instagram pages that I mentioned. There's also via social media, a lot of charity events are organized. For example, there's Trans Community Kitchen, who are a nonprofit based in Chennai in India. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, they used primarily social media through Instagram to raise money to help provide food for trans people who are suffering from homelessness during the crisis. So I think like these are ways in which like digital spaces and platforms can really kind of cater to and like help people kind of come together and like provide a lens for viewing diverse like queer food cultures. And I also think there is something to be said for the amount of knowledge that is present in these spaces, but is kind of overlooked in academic spaces because of the certain elitism that is present in academia, and the kind of knowledge and language barriers that are present between the common social media and academia. So I think in that way, these digital platforms really do kind of consolidate these perspectives.
Thanks very much, Priyanka. Really, really interesting. We have two more questions from James Staples, after which I will draw this panel to a close. James, over to you.
Oh, okay, thanks. Well, I'll be very quick. In fact, I did have questions for everybody, but I'll limit them to a question to Aditi, which I think probably could also be applied to Regina as well. And it also, I think, fits with some of the discussion. There's a very interesting discussion, which you can perhaps look at afterwards on the chat, about cuisines of the Northeast, and particularly about fermentation and so on. In Aditi's paper, you mentioned that there were conflicts between migrants from the Northeast and what you described as mainland Indian households over food, and how common these were. I suppose I was wondering what these referenced specifically, whether these were fights about, I know that I think both of you mentioned things about in relation to smell and associations with disgust and so on. Was it about smell, or was it about something else? You know, I suppose I was trying to get a handle on the ways in which food focused featured specifically in relation to these conflicts.
Thank you for the question, James. So with fermentation food, there is a very strong olfactory element to it. So this smell, this scent or smell can be described as unique, and also it evokes a sense of belongingness, home, and a sense of community amongst the people who consume the fermented food. Communities, migrant communities from the Northeast who consumes fermented food far away from home, to evoke a sense of community and bonds over the food. Olfactory, the scent and the olfactory element is a major part of the fermented food, and the conflict that happens between the migrant Northeastern communities and their non-Northeastern neighbors who are resident of Delhi, or who have rented their apartment to them. It's one of the main reason is the smell, they describe the smell as they describe the food as smelly, as stinky, and because of the unique scent. There was a film made on it as well, which was problematic, a little problematic as well. The film was called Akhuni, and Akhuni means the fermented soybean, and so this the content, the conflict over the olfactory aspect of the food is shown there. Also, this conflict is a part of the larger racial profiling and discrimination and racism that Northeast migrants face in Delhi and other metropolitan cities of mainland India. So the racism takes place, one because of their distinct looks, and the other is their way of life. And food and consumption practices is a very important way of part of life, part of the their way of life. So this conflict between conflict over fermented food and also other kinds of food, like they also when the migrant Northeastern migrants go to find places to live, go flat hunting or house hunting, they're often asked, what are you going to cook? Are you going to cook this particular meat? Are you going to cook that smelly food? So the smell is an important, is a significant part for which the conflict happens.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, oh, sorry, yes, go on.
Yeah, I'll just quickly kind of respond. I think the conflict was more an internal conflict about being mainstreamed Adivasis, but having to participate in our own invisibility, because many of the food items, especially meat, and I'm talking about intestines, and suppose you ate pork, there is a specific smell. When you make these non-vegetarian food, there is a lot of onions and garlic and this thing to camouflage the strong smell. So, and if somebody visits your house and the first question is like, what have you cooked? There's something special, and you're not able to share because, so the conflict is around that if you shared, that you would be mocked at, laughed, shamed, and maybe future socialization is you do at the cost of affecting your future socialization. So the conflict is more with the self of partaking in our own invisibility.
Thank you. Yeah, there are really strong resonances here too with, beef. I've worked with beef, with people who eat beef, particularly with Dalit and Muslim and Christian communities who eat beef, and particularly dried beef, which has many of those things that you've said about smell and so on are really reflected in the kinds of comments that people came back to me with, and not being allowed to rent houses and so on. But yeah, sorry, I'll shut up because you're looking at me sternly, Peggy.
I am. Thanks very much, James. And that's a really fitting kind of way to end, I think, Regina, with your kind of final comment there. Really, really interesting and very, very insightful. With that, I'd like to thank all four sets of presenters for an extremely rich, fascinating panel. There's so much more that I think that can be said on food and resistance and the politics of food and so on, but I think we just barely scratched the surface here. So extremely well done. Really, really interesting discussion and so on. So well done, everyone. Right, we're slightly over time. We're going to break now, but only for, 8 minutes. We are going to try and reconvene at 15:40 UK time. So you've got an 8-minute break, or should we give them till 1:45, James? Let's give them till 1:45. 8 minutes is silly. So you have 13 minutes tea break. We will reconvene at 15:45 UK time. So that's 13 minutes from now. We are going to start exactly at 15:45. Please don't be late. We want to get the workshop back on track. And we look forward to hearing our final panel on migration, food, and identity. So see you all in 13 minutes. The YouTube link and the Zoom link remain the same.
And the YouTube link will remain live. So just yeah, be advised to turn your cameras and your sound off. Otherwise, you're beaming directly to the whole world. See you in a few minutes. Right, welcome back, everybody. Hope you got a moment of comfort break in there, at least. So this brings us to the final panel of the day, which we've called Migration, Food and Identity. So welcome. Sorry, Young, you're still awake and still with us. Sorry. So we've got 4 papers, and sorry, we've only got 3 of the 4 papers. Alan Mersel-Sanker, unfortunately, is unable to join us because of a medical emergency that's happened today, but we have 3, and we'll proceed again in the same way as we did before. We'll start with Debanjali Biswas, whose paper is entitled Receiving, Relishing and Recreating Fermented Food in Diaspora Kitchen, which very nicely carries on, I think, from some of the discussion that we've already been having. So over to you, Debanjali. I think you're still muted.
Starting my screen share now.
You can, yes.
I'm sorry, I had it down to this just a minute back. Yes.
Yeah. Oh.
Right. So that's where we are at the moment. People who have had the time to go through the paper may have noticed the note, and I have put a little note in the beginning of our presentation today. Some of my work that I wanted to present in the paper, I had to withdraw it out of respect from the ongoing conditions in Manipur at the moment. But nevertheless, I'll persevere with the rest and hoping to connect them with the amazing conversations we were having in the last panel as well. How did you mark your arrival to this country? The last time, the first time, and many times in between, with a hot plate of chaat and morok methpa and nari. Mrs. Okram's impassioned statement is a reflection of her domestic life in the diasporic space where she has lived for almost 16 years. Every evening, she and her husband cook Meitei food for their family of 5, comprised of rice accompanied by boiled and stir-fried vegetables, salad, fish. The simple, sumptuous meals are not complete without roots, shoots, herbs, fermented fish, and charred chili. At the end of every visit from Manipur, she says, she tears open the food packages that she carries with them. Most carry moderate amounts of preserved, smoked, and fermented comestibles that are taxing to make in an English kitchen and weather. After a tiring intercontinental journey, we make a large bowl of rice, squash our chili with nari, and there is no need to cook. We have a belly full of home food, but also the stirring olfactory memories of homeland. Fermented food is made by manipulating microbes, often invisible agents, which alters the aroma, texture, longevity of the staple. Fermentation is a practice in which complex collectives of humans, animals, plants, fungi, and bacteria meet and thrive. In this presentation, I trace if fermented food from the northeastern regions of India transforms communities, economies, and identities amongst the diaspora community in the United Kingdom. It is a long-standing source of sustenance among the peoples of Manipur and can be used to create distinct accounts of community histories, including social and culinary practices, gustatory identities, gendered and intergenerational ways of doing and knowing how and what to ferment. It is, as one of my younger respondents say, to know that Singchu, a salad made of vegetables and fermented food, to know that Singchu stands as tall as sauerkraut or kimchi, which means to find a significant presence of her culinary heritage and a gustatory identity amongst other similar food cultures. Manipur is a region of connected and contested histories. Since 2006, I have worked as a researcher in Imphal Valley, which is the home to the largest community, the Meiteis, and comparatively smaller indigenous groups whose homelands are primarily tethered to the hills. Conversations on and around food have been integral to my learning many other facets of Meitei life during my doctoral fieldwork in the valley areas. I veered towards understanding more about sustaining culinary practices of Meiteis and Tangkhul Nagas after meeting many of them at various small and large events in the UK. What I have begun to explore now is what political and food anthropologist Dolly Kikon notes as associative relationship between fermented food and communities, or transethnicity, or lived experiences bound by the foodways of fermented products. Drawing from culinary practices and conversations about fermentation and consumption amongst the Manipuri peoples residing in Manipur and the UK, I want to focus on two questions. How do we trace the gustatory identity of a community from South Asia within an absence of representation? And how does the culinary heritage cope with being uprooted and rerouted in foreign soil? I locate certain kinds of food in what anthropologist Robert Dunn and his team calls the global ecology of fermented food, along with the obstacles and opportunities of sourcing, cooking, and sharing them, staying true to the taste of homeland and reclaim placemaking in the diasporic space in the UK. A culinary history of Manipur's food in the UK is challenging to trace. Almost all respondents echo a second-generation Meitei immigrant, Mr. Okram's words. None of the restaurants stocked the sort of food we were used to eating at home, and since most of the time we preferred eating at home, we had to get creative with substituting or sourcing ingredients in Manipuri recipes. The diverse overlapping social and gustatory identities of immigrants from any of the northeastern states did not reflect in South Asian curry houses, thereby creating an absence of flavors and foodways, as well as an absence of a range of social and cultural connotations that were connected to the subcontinent. Even the Indian food produced to accommodate the British taste was an affront to the Indians. Additionally, it did not stop the everyday casual racism mated to the migrants settling in the UK by the once colonial masters, as Elizabeth Butner notes in her work. But Indian restaurant food does not always represent our food flavors, Mr. Okram says, just as what Wooters and Suba would say that they have un-Indian looks. Manipuri food, Meitei, as well as tribal cuisine, is cooked with very little oil. Vegetables flavored with herbs and spices are stewed, smoked, stir-fried, and steamed, and a variety of riverine, woodland, flora, and fauna are incorporated into it. In many households in Manipur, meat and poultry are not considered staple, but often cooked by the men in the courtyards, whereas in the tribal houses, eating meat and entomophagy are common. A variety of chilies occupy an important position in the food cultures. It is a special skill to know how to use chili to secure the distinct taste of every kind of food, where it blends with the gravy, where it stays separate and sharp, how far it should be charred or grounded in a mortar with pestle. Similarly, the knowledge of preparing reserves of aged foods is entangled in relationships between people and local environment, various networks of farmsteads and fisheries, skills of accurately processing all ingredients and regulating the environment conducive to preserving, and finally, understanding and utilizing the climatic conditions specific to time, season, place. Moreover, in Manipur, fermentation is a biosocial process. Fermented products are considered heritage ethnic food. It continues to be one of the oldest and most economic methods to infuse a diversity of flavors, aroma, texture that bridges communities' ancient food cultures and contemporary diet. Laishram Kheroda, an expert who runs her own fermented food business in Imphal, explains that the robustness of fermented food ensures it pairs well with every other plant, fish, or meat in the ecology. Moreover, it can be used frugally, so a little goes a long way. Along with the skills, the foodway relies on embodied practices and reliable memory that can be traced back to the hearth of their childhood homes. The hearth in a Meitei or a Tangkhul home is a sacred space, which is not only used for cooking and collecting meals, but to gather for warmth and light and create space for cultivating intergenerational ties. The Meitei storytelling traditions of Phungawari or Chak Naiwari, stories told around the fire, has been a source of passing on experiences, fables, morals. Mrs. Thodam remembers that in winters, children of her family were responsible for moving the Nari Chafu, the earthen pot containing fish, to the closest point next to the hearth, where the fire burned. They learned to judge the optimum distance so that the fish could ferment and the heated pot would not crack. For such communities, Sydney Mintz had observed a fabric of cultivation, processing, kitchen lore, cuisine, and folklore in which people learn from infancy about the foods they grow to like. Tastes are more commonly acquired in that way. Mrs. Thodam learned how to integrate nari into various dishes by watching her grandmother char fermented fish over open fire. After settling in England, whenever she looked to move houses, she opted for a kitchen equipped with a gas hob and not an electric burner, as the former allowed the use of the flame to char various products. Within the context of immigrant geographies, and despite finding themselves at the center of one of the world's famously Epicurean cities, London, the Okrams quickly found that replacing the herbs in traditional Meitei cuisine is challenging. Conventionally, when learning to cook, it is accompanied by identifying herbs and shoots that grow locally. They can be plucked from their own or neighbor's garden or basically acquired from the market. While living in the UK, having failed to grow some herbs that could give the food that distinct taste also meant finding fitting substitutes. So pak pai had to be replaced by Vietnamese coriander or Cambodian mint, sourced from the local Korean shop. The Asian pennywort or peruk could never be found. Or yendem could be replaced with a close relative of taro leaves. And on their yearly visit, the Okrams stock up on haribo, a rare citrus fruit found only in the northeastern states, whose fleshy rind adds tanginess to gravies and once dried is used as spice. For the Okrams, cooking in their home in London always meant cooking Meitei food. And Mr. Okram says, becoming friendly with the Bangladeshi fishmonger was a very good move, as they gave good rates for a lot of fish. This discovery by my respondents also alerts them of a shared gastronomic zone that they probably would not have encountered living in Manipur, as their homeland has a surplus of riverine and littoral fish and fish-based products, and so does Bangladesh. Having arrived in the early 2000s, they found more Bangladeshi fish sellers in many English cities from whom they could source preserved fish than any other South Asian shops, and that continues still today. The preserved shidol shutki, made from the small scaly puti or Pantias sophore, is an integral part of Bangladeshi food culture. These products come from a similar tradition of wet weather preservation where sun-drying food items for longer period is not feasible. But once packaged for overseas, the delivery from the fishmonger ends in slowly taking apart the package and the biting aroma instantly triggering the memory of Manipuri home and hearth they have left behind. In the past decade, Sagolsam family have been replenishing their stock by ordering from an Imphal-based online portal from time to time. But prior to that, he says, in spite of packing the food in tightly sealed boxes, our luggage came on the carousel giving out faint odor, but we did not mind. We carried a piece of our home and joy with us. In the natural process, nari is prepared by removing excess water, by pressing down on them. The nari chafu is lined by mustard oil. The sun-dried fish is then sealed with mud and clay. It usually is stored for 3 to 4 months at a room temperature, and some varieties mature at 6 to 12 months before producing the characteristic aroma. The other common product that is made from sun-dried fish is hentak. These fishes are mixed with onion, banana, mustard seed, oil, and chili, powdered, rolled into balls, and stored in earthen pot for under a fortnight and mixed with some taro plant. The packaging of fermented and pickled hentak, some believe, predates the packaging and circulation of nari outside Manipur. But such journey was undertaken only to a few geographical areas dominated by Manipuri and tribal population, such as Tripura, Assam, Nagaland, and certain districts of Myanmar and Bangladesh, thereby charting another trans-regional and transnational circuit of ethnic food. Nari can now be widely delivered through the years of COVID-19 pandemic peaked, delivery of food products from India was either banned or was operationally complex, leading a shift in how these products could be accessed in the UK. International travel was prohibited, so people could not return to visit India. The three families who I quote here, who are socially mobile and have ample social capital, know someone who also knows someone who can easily collect fermented products from small, mostly home-based enterprises and parcel them to the UK. Towards the end of the pandemic, Mr. Sagolsem says, we had 10 kilograms of Hawaizar or fermented soybean delivered from Imphal and about 5 kilograms of lafu or banana stem from Sylhet in Bangladesh. This finds resonance with Dunn and his team's findings on possible changes that can occur in global ecosystem or biodiversity due to microbial changes introduced by technological advancement, but also Paxson's research on impact of worldwide network, that is import and export of specialty food. Heather Paxson, who has documented the transcontinental movement of perishable goods such as fermented products, note that the work of coordinating the space, time, temperature of perishable logistics is profit-driven, yes, but it's also driven by the pleasure and pride taken in the skillful exercise of specialty trade. Even then, there is little control on fermentation as a process or the aroma that emanates from it. Fermented food invokes memory and distinctive olfactory, gustatory, and bodily sensations. One person's fragrant is another's pungent. After migrating to the UK, when the Okrams used to live in flats in London, cooking with nari or hawaizar often prompted neighbors to share mild disgust or curiosity because it did not smell like Indian food, curried or garlicky. The centrality of smell in identifying the various stages of fermentation is important, but it also can be extended to various conditions of marginalization. As Dolly Kekon argues, fermented food is dirty and stinky. That notion is derived from prejudices ingrained in the social hierarchy found in Indian mainland. Indigenous norms, rules, beliefs, values, including taste and aesthetics, are relegated to an inferior status. In New Delhi, in the last decade, urban sociologist Duncan McDuira has found that food has been used as leverage against migrants from northeastern states, and they have been targeted for unfamiliar odors of their staple diet that consists fermented food. Similar food-based discrimination experienced by migrants from these regions are not as widespread in the UK. The Meitei families shared that living in compact spaces like flats meant once in a while there would be complaints, but they were not implicitly racist remarks. Just the cooking of fermented food bothered them. Harassed because of her food preferences in New Delhi in the 1980s, discrimination, as mentioned by McDuira and Dolly Kekon, did not follow Mrs. Thodam to the UK. Here, she claims to be freer to grow, cook, eat, and to share with my Thankful sisters. Mrs. Thodam has reconciled with the rage of her youth, but she also points at a vital factor of sharing food across ethnic lines, or that fermented food plays an important role in creating a sense of alliance or amity with women from other ethnic communities. Trans ethnicity, according to Kekon, as a culinary identity, recognizes food practices and community connections at a particular junctures of history, and to which I will add, existing in a global fermented food ecosystem, where accounts of fermented food create polarizing experiences of what is considered palatable and repugnant. It can bring together individuals and communities beyond tribal and indigenous hostility, including feelings stemming from racism, alienation, injustice, conflict, and experiences of being un-Indian-looking Indians. The notion of transethnicity or rendering shared bonds over food to politics and solidarity beyond ethnic lines encourages me to think about imagining a trans-ethnic culinary community of peoples from the northeastern region of India in the UK. I leave this presentation at this point, as currently I am struggling to put trans-ethnicity into context, not as a concept for my current research, But due to the breaking down of inter-ethnic socialities owing to the current turmoil stemming from conflict in Manipur. For now, the creative negotiations to maintain gustatory identity by receiving, relishing, and recreating food of their homeland in Manipuri diaspora kitchen can be read as small victories or acts of resilience. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thanks too for bringing to our attention some of the other events that are going on in Manipur, which I think are not perhaps being widely publicized elsewhere. We'll move quickly on now to Young Hoon Oh. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If you want to put your screen on.
Yes, you are. Yes.
Yep, excellent. So I'll leave, thank you. I'll leave it, I'll hand straight over to you for your paper, which is entitled Goodbye to Millet Wine, Village Sherpas Migrating to Kathmandu and Seeking New Status. Thank you.
Let me first share my screen. Thank you very much, James and others, for organizing all this. I am now talking from South Korea, and it's now approaching midnight, and but I'm still alert because the papers are so enjoyable and it's very interesting. The papers are very well fitting together nicely, so I'm surprised that as well. So therefore it's my great pleasure to be able to share my research with you all. And I've conducted a long-term research about people of Sherpas living in the village of Walung in the Sankhassaba district, northeastern Nepal. In Walung, consuming chang is paramount in their everyday lives. Chang is the Sherpa word for the local wine, widely popular in rural Nepal. That's made from millet, but sometimes from corn, barley, or potato. Meanwhile, many Sherpas have recently relocated to Kathmandu in search of better opportunities, and they generally stopped practicing the tradition of chang consumption. By focusing on the changing practices of chang consumption among the Sherpas in the migratory context, I want to here consider the meanings food may epitomize in relation to changing life experiences. So the consumption of chang is so widespread in their everyday lives. A neighbor walking by is called upon to stop by. Even a stranger is beckoned and they say, "Shok chang she, come and please drink chang." Multiple cups of chang should be consumed before a long journey, for which they also used to bring a bottle of chang to help them on the way. Farmers carry steamed potato and a bottle of chang for lunch. For a village festival, the host spends a considerable portion of funds, time, and energy for preparation of an adequate supply of chang. A crying baby is of course to be soothed with mother's milk, but also with chang. If you want to ostracize a fellow villager, you might want to accuse them of making a bad chang or even poisoning chang they serve. In the practices of consuming chang, the villagers generally follow a set of rules that epitomize social dynamics in the Sherpa community. A strong solicitation to force the visitor to drink the beverage is ritualized, and it's considered greedy to drink the served chang without repeating forceful gestures of refusals. So usually a server brings the cup of chang to the mouth of the served, gracefully and theatrically as well, repeatedly saying in a typically salutary tone, "She, she," meaning drink please. To this, the visitor used to turn their head far away, even shutting their eyes in order to avoid seeing the cup, while blocking the approaching cup with both of their hands and urgently plead and say, "Mutung, mutung, I don't drink, I don't drink, I don't drink." So this everyday drama of chang serving, especially for the first cup, almost always ends up with the hostess being the winner. By the compulsory drinking of chang, the consumer semiotically comes under the supervision of the particular household and especially of the housewife. Consuming chang makes the visitor, laborer, or passerby relaxed and full. The vitality in the warmth and sweet taste characteristic to the sips of chang intervenes the drinker's bodily mood and may allow them to engage in the dialogue and repartees with the house husband more lively. It's important to note here that the chang involved was exclusively administered by the Sherpa housewife, who may or may not participate in the conversation which the very chang has facilitated. Women produce the beverages as they hold exclusive responsibility for, as well as rights in harvesting millets, barley, corns, and potatoes, drying the winnowing grain, husking corn, fermenting them, so brewing wine, and boiling hard liquor, and most visibly serving them. In the village tradition of gender division of labor, Sherpa men have long undertaken tasks that demand them to frequently stay away from home for an extended period. They engaged in long-distance trade, herdsman husbandry, and more recently, Himalayan mountaineering. Expedition participation in each season generally takes about 2 or 3 months. On the other hand, Sherpa women are generally in charge of nearly everything at home and in the village. They had to endure most of the toils of agriculture throughout Himalayan seasons, working in the fields and tending cows, pigs, and chickens. Precisely with this exclusive laboring, the women hold a high level of authority over the household economy, to which they contribute the most. In the summer of 2012, I started visiting Sherpa houses in Walloon for research. In the same year, 4 Sherpa brothers from Walloon founded an expedition agency called Seven Summit Treks. The oldest brother is Mingma Sherpa, who in the next year claimed to be the first Nepali who reached all the summits of the 14 peaks over 8,000 meters. Thanks to his and his brother's mountain experiences, personal connections, and up-to-date knowledge of how to best climb Himalayan peaks, Seven Summit Treks has been able to offer climbing opportunities to international clients at a relatively cheaper price, quickly becoming the leading company in the highly competitive international market of Himalayan mountaineering tourism. In contrast to the Sherpa men from Khumbu near Mount Everest, who began joining expeditions as early as 1950s, those from Walloon and the surrounding region had no such lucrative option until the 1990s. A handful of men seeking better chances in Darjeeling and Kathmandu were fortunate to get connected to and hired by a few expedition operators. It was the early 2010s, finally, when Walloon Sherpa men began to be able to secure more positions season by season, and expeditions responding to the rising demand of climbing guides from the thriving Seven Summit Treks and a few subsequently founded tourism agencies. Throughout the 2010s, an increasing number of younger Sherpa couples from Walloon decided to permanently move to near the thriving agencies located in the northeastern corner of Kathmandu in search of successful career and better education for their children as well. Their Sherpas from Walloon chose to live close to one another. Like in the village, they continue to gather together and regularly organize a variety of community events and meetings, notably for marriage, funeral, and the New Year's party. Unlike in the village, however, in the urban environment, it was not possible to organize such a gathering at someone's home. Instead, they rented a large community hall. Instead of cooking together, moreover, they sell a ticket for everyone and collect money so as to order a catered food. Perhaps unsurprisingly, in such a gathering, chang is no longer consumed profusely. Few, if any, would choose to try the now unfashionable beverage for a cup or more. While chang may be prepared at the venues from the market, it will be prepared in a large thermos from which anyone may fill up their cup as they like. Nobody solicits or is solicited to drink the wine. This picture shows a very, very rare occasion, so people left off because of the rarity. A small male gathering may take place at anyone's home in the capital. Hardly is chang served there either. They might enjoy bottles of beer or coke or juice as purchased instantly from a local shop nearby. Also, Sherpa ladies no longer take part in facilitating the men's social occasion with such authority of representing the household. While the Sherpa ladies in the new urban context initially found themselves had to rely on the cash earned by their husbands or brothers, soon they moved beyond and began working for their own income in, for example, restaurants and beauty shops. More broadly, binging, still frequent in the village among the remaining elderly farmers, it is never an acceptable behavior in the bustling town. Not a few Sherpa men proclaimed that they completely stopped drinking alcoholic beverages, and they often jokingly scorn the custom of heavy drinking of chang, but not about beer or liquor for that matter. In this creation of new ethics of sobriety in the capitalistic life world in reference to the bygone village life, chang is relegated as the lifeless relic of the past associated with all stigmas that mark the undeveloped past and unmodern rurality that they want to make distinction from. Although village life is now discounted by the migrant Sherpas for being tough, boring, lazy, and too much chang drinking, it still is continuously idealized as a place of clean water and tasty air, of healthy food, and somewhat strikingly, of chang that wouldn't render any drinker sick. Sherpas have successfully monopolized the mountaineering tourism industry to the extent that they converted their ethnic title Sherpa to a generic term referring to a climbing guide. The monopoly has been an evolving one. They once were in charge of carrying luggage and setting up tents on a high terrain, but now they guide clients and organize expeditions by collecting climbers worldwide. Being ethnically Sherpa will not guarantee a position in an expedition though, but firm and wide interpersonal connections will do. From Wallam Sherpa's point of view, strong connections that translate to job security are founded by their originating from the same village and being cousin related to one another. In the uncertain, seemingly chaotic world of migrants' lives in the ever-expanding capital, Sherpas may become confident with a certain level of certainty and security through living side by side and working together in an expedition. As they used to say to me that climbing together is one of the most important aspects of fun. Autochthony, the identity of place of origin, plays a significant role for the migrant Sherpas, not simply out of the feeling of homesickness, but crucially, it epitomizes most of the materialized solutions they came up with through new environment of employment, dwelling, and social lives. In short, becoming larger than life through ethnicity and autochthony, the two most prominent categories that crisscross the fast-changing society of Nepal, proved to be the most feasible way to success for the Sherpas. So in this context of migration and occupation, the ironic perception of chang as both rejected and idealized may be understood by the fact that it entails ambivalent qualities. It sustains and hurts. It nurses and damages. It drives one energized and mad. The ambivalence characteristic to chang has served for the Sherpas to appreciate the equally ambivalent features of their changing lives. Some of them had to be foregone, while others came to be appreciated. The dwindling significance of chang captures more than how the Sherpas imagine their positions in time and space. It also captures how expectations and social rules for Sherpa women and men have changed at the junctures of tradition and modernity, of stability and mobility, and of ethnicity and Himalayan mountaineering. The overlapping semiotic plays of social dynamics between women and men in Wallung is hardly observable in the everyday lives of urban Sherpas. The capitalistic lifestyle Sherpas collectively appreciated in the capital is governed by more straightforward social dynamics, leaving the ambivalent gendered relationships behind. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Bang on time. In fact, I think you've even saved a couple of minutes. So yeah, well done for that. I'll just bring my clapping emoji out. Before we go on to what will be our final paper, I had promised Alan, Methil, Sanka and Deepak Tamaka, who couldn't unfortunately be here in the end, that I would just share with you at least, obviously not the paper, but they were particularly keen that everybody should see or have the link to a website project that they've been working on called foodsofnepal.com. I thought I wouldn't remember it without the slide, but actually it's a fairly simple web address where they've been documenting as a kind of project of a kind of heritage project. And I had some questions about that, which obviously I won't now ask. But which collects together a range of resources in relation to food in Nepal. Now I'm just trying to work out how to not share now. Stop share, that must be it. Okay, so thank you for that. That's given you an opportunity to get that, and for people on YouTube. So we now move to our final paper by Marilena Frisone. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
Good. Thank you. Okay, so straight over to you, Marilena. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share the screen, and hopefully you can confirm that you can see it.
We can see it, yes. And
perfect.
Excellent.
Perfect. Thank you to the organizers for including me, and thank you also to all the speakers, which I had the great pleasure to listen to. Really interesting thoughts. So the title of my paper is Iconic and Lexical Identities, Food, Reflexivity and Belonging in the Nepalese Newar Diaspora in London. Naite Nyamatye, where there is food, people come, says an old Newar proverb encapsulating the social-cultural importance of food among members of the Nepalese Newar ethnic community. On the 23rd of February 2019, the Facebook page Newari Jokes shared a post which consisted of two juxtaposed pictures. The first one showing, sorry, don't know if you can see the bar or not. I'm trying to get rid of it. I hope it's okay. So share the first one showing a glass of lemonade and a cup of tea, and the second presenting an arrangement of 12 different dishes belonging to Newar traditional cuisine and served in various combinations during the numerous feasts that mark Newar religious calendar and social life. The pictures contain the two sentences in Nepali, the one written over the first picture saying, going for a date with the Bahun Sangan dating Jada, and the one written over the second picture saying, going for a date with a Newar Sangha dating Jada. The implication is clear. When dating a member of the Bahun caste, you will only get to drink a lemonade or a tea, whereas when dating a member of the Newar ethnic group, you will enjoy a huge variety of delicious snacks, vegetables, meat, beans, etc. At a deeper level, the post implies a stereotypical image of oneself and the other. Bahuns are negatively presented as lacking a rich culinary tradition linked to an appreciation of social life and conviviality, whereas Newars are characterized by a lavish display of generosity and festive behavior, and by a passion for good food, good company, and good life. The two groups, as essentialized in these juxtaposed pictures, are thus defined in opposition to each other. Both these examples are clearly based on what we call stereotypes or oversimplified definitions of oneself and the other. For Michael Hertzfeld, culinary stereotypes are particularly interesting, not so much because they do or do not, most often the case, tell the truth about a certain social group, but rather because of the way in which they are used to convey a certain perception of the self and perception of the other. Stereotypes thus sustain solidarity among those who are presented as members of the same group, while also reinforcing discrimination or differentiation between communities. Michael Silverstein calls these stereotypes cultural concepts, a sort of tacit knowledge or shared cultural competence often invoked in communicative interactions. For Silverstein, situations of language in use, that is, communicative events, enact a double mechanism. They evoke supposedly pre-existing cultural concepts or stereotypes and temporarily stabilize them in a form of textuality, a mechanism which he calls entextualization. while at the same time anchoring them to the here and now of the communicative situation through the use of indexical elements, a mechanism, this one, that he calls contextualization. A process, this last one, which then has a transformative effect on the self-alignment of participants in the communicative situation, thus bringing into being their social role and their social belonging. Silverstein describes this process more in detail through the idea of iconic index, which he uses to explain how ritual actions, as emblematic examples of other communicative interactions, often evoke, thus iconic, cultural concepts at the level of cosmic values, while simultaneously indexically anchoring their meaning and performativity in the here and now of the ritual practice. According to the semiotics of Charles Peirce, an icon is defined as a sign linked to its object by a relation of analogy or resemblance, whereas an index is a sign linked to its object by a relation of spatial temporal contiguity or causality. As an example, Silverstein analyzes the Eucharist ritual performed in a Christian church and shows how ritual works here as an iconic index. Iconic because it is presented in analogy with the first occurrence of such action located in a cosmic order of things, so the Last Supper in this case. And it's indexical because the very act of performing it changes or affects the audience attending or participating, transforming the act of eating and drinking bread and wine into the act of becoming members of a community, that is the church. Although participation in festivals and feasts is certainly a defining aspect of what it means to be Newa and constitutes an opportunity to reenact such a sense of belonging to this specific ethnic community, it is striking that little research has been done on this topic in diasporic context. There are few recent studies focusing on Nepalese foodways in the diaspora, but very little has been written so far on Newa foodways outside of Nepal. Based on a long-term ethnographic engagement with the community, which started in 2015, this paper explores how Newas in London reflexively choose the type of food to be prepared for public and private feasts or events, negotiating its values and performing a multiple sense of belonging to Nepal and the UK. Developing Silverstein's concept of iconic index, I will suggest that when participating in social interactions that involve the consumption of food, Newas in London enact a form of subjectivity that both iconically refers to what it means to be Newa in Nepal, so analogically relating to festivals, rituals, feasts, and traditional foods consumed there, but also indexically anchors them to the here and now of their lives in London. Thus turning them into members of the diaspora community. So rather than aiming at constructing some sort of reified identity, a supposed traditional or stereotyped image of themselves, Newas in London thus enact in what I will call an iconic indexical identity. Sensory iconicity. During my fieldwork, I have been noticing a rising interest among the Newa diasporic community for the organization of events that focus on food. Like, for example, the Newa Guti Bue, this feast, which I attended on the 29th of September 2018. Here, a great effort had been made to serve a large variety of Newa dishes, arranging them according to a specific order and serving them in the traditional lapte leaf plate and bote leaf bowls, while consuming the food sitting on the floor and eating with hands. On a different occasion, while sitting at a restaurant and discussing with one of the leaders of the community on the menu he would be providing for another event, I asked him the following question. Why do you think is there an increased interest in Newa food in the community? And he immediately replied, well, Newas have always been interested in food and they've always celebrated festivals with feasts. But I will give you three main reasons why we are interested in this topic. For one thing, we miss Nepal. So the food brings us close to home. It's linked to feeling at home, feeling Newa. Also, we now have easier access to the ingredients that are required to prepare Newa dishes here in the UK. And finally, young people now want to experiment with food. For example, I want to try and create a recipe to make a momo dessert. So the dumplings that we saw earlier, actually. At that point, my interlocutor's wife, who had been listening to the conversation, mentioned the fact that she and her husband had once agreed on going out for romantic dinners. She was happy about this decision because, apart from spending some quality time together, going out also implied that she didn't have to worry about cooking dinner. Except that, as she explained, coming back home from their night out, her husband would ask her if she could kindly also cook dalbat anyway, because dalbat meaning rice and lentils, but also the word that is normally used to indicate a meal, Nepali meal. So he would ask her if she could kindly cook dalbat anyway, because, as her husband said, I couldn't feel fully satisfied about the dinner unless I ate dalbat at home with my hands. In other words, going out for dinner and tasting different cuisines, while being a pleasant activity, could not fully qualify as having dinner, because having dinner meant eating ordinary Nepali food with hands in the comfort of one's home. This feeling is shared by other members of the community who often told me that when they eat out something which is not dalbat, it's like not having eaten at all. Nakaeko justo lagcha. First refers to iconic qualisigns precisely as the relation between sensory qualities and values. Similarly, for my interlocutor, eating Nepali food at home functions as a qualisign, you could say. It iconically recreates a familiar sensorial environment, so that while eating abroad, far from their origins in Nepal, they can still remember home. Recalling Abbott's, we could say that food, consumed both in the private sphere of home and in the public context of a guti bhue, so a feast, quote, transcends space and time, end quote, iconically allowing Newar migrants to connect to the distant place of their origins in Nepal and to pass social events experienced there, transporting them, so to speak, back home. So migration, rather than being seen as an abstract or cognitive experience, should be considered as an intensively embodied one, as suggested by Abbott. My interlocutor and his wife's statements remind us that migration is experienced through the body, says Abbott, and that the act of eating typical Nepali or Newar food represents an attempt of resisting the discontinuity of migration, creating continuity through a sensorial experience. And here I'm referring to the work of Kodesal. Creative indexicalities. In a post shared on Facebook on the 2nd of October 2019, one of the most active members in the Newar community uploaded a 1-minute video, what he called a short movie, Gundruk series, entitled Spaghetti Gundruk with Chicken and Bamboo Shoots, Nepali title, Spaghetti Gundruk Chicken Ratama, in which he exhorted his friends to try his new recipe. The recipe mixes a traditional ingredient used in Newar food, which is gundruk, a fermented green vegetable, with Italian pasta or Chinese noodles, seasoning used in Nepali and Newar cuisine, and bamboo shoots, also used in one traditional Newar dish called alutama. And the video itself mirrors the intentional mix and fusion of the ingredients in the recipe, reflexively and ironically playing with cultural stereotypes. This is one of many videos that the member of the community has posted on his Facebook page, where he shares creative culinary ideas. For example, he also posts on chaku buns, that is buns filled with some kind of molasses, typical of 2 Newar festivals called Yataku and Yomori, what he himself called a fusion inspired by Yomori and custard buns. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide the traditional Yomori, the traditional dish, and on the left-hand side his creative reinterpretation. And another time he presented his recipe for a momo or dumpling breakfast. So these examples show how iconic dishes from Nepal, while evoking cultural values related to Newar identity, may be indexically anchored to the highly heterogeneous foodscape that characterizes the everyday life of Newars in the UK, producing new creative reconfigurations. Another dish that appeared on his Facebook at the end of February 2020 was entitled Cross Country Breakfast, and his status read Feeling Creative. The dish consisted of a 3-layer combination of, and it's in the title of the dish that they gave to the dish, water on top of pancake on top of aloo paratha. Thus, visually and linguistically, also in the way the dish is described in 3 lines, combining a traditional Newar lentils cake, water, with pancakes typical of British or American breakfast, and finally, with an Indian bread made of potatoes, aloo paratha. Innovation in the field of food traditions and habits actively contributes to a renegotiation of identities in which iconic values related to food and sociality in Nepal are indexically reinscribed into different foodways practiced in London, bringing about distinctive iconic indexical identities for Newar Londoners. In conclusion, this dual sense of belonging is important. This dual sense of belonging is important to contextualize the iconic index subjectivities that emerge through food and language practices. Newars reflectively experience both a sense of belonging to the community in London, that is the indexical part of their subjectivity, while simultaneously reaffirming their connection with the community in Nepal, recreating similar events, and thus the iconic aspect. This double sense of belonging, rather than a monolithic nostalgic attitude towards home in Nepal, often emerges in the interviews when, to the question, where is home, some people reply, where, here or in Nepal? Clearly both matter and both count as home. Newars in London recreate a sense of home, meaning Nepal, in the displaced context of the UK, which nonetheless also becomes home for the diaspora. So engaging in the production of traditional Newar food, they manage to remember and thus reconnect to their homes in Nepal, while simultaneously, like Kodesal says, remembering themselves as part of an iconic indexical community in the diaspora who has made of London its new home. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, and also for good timekeeping, and all of you for great images, very evocative sets of slides that you've all used. So thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our presentations. I'm just going to very briefly, before I open up the floor to everybody for questions, both here in the Zoom room, and I think there are a couple of questions which have already come in on YouTube, and if you have more, please add to them there. Let me start. Yeah, I'll start by just saying something. I'll pose a couple of questions perhaps to each of you, which you don't need to answer in detail, but maybe some food for thought. I mean, the papers are all quite different, but all of them in some way, it seemed to me, charted the kinds of transformations or the changes that occur as food and people move across space. And it's not just the food or just the people that change. And it seems that this is something that happens whether it's internal migrations. We've seen this actually in several of the papers in lots of the panels, or across the world. You know, some of you highlighted how it was the meaning of food, what particular foods meant, or drink, that was transformed as it crossed borders. You know, these different meanings that attributed to Chang, which was something that was valued and looked at in a certain way, nostalgic way, when looking back towards the village, but which was seen as, you know, indexing rurality and backwardness and so on in Kathmandu. Others spoke about how the food itself was transformed, sometimes because of being unable to access key ingredients, which obviously had an impact. Others about how people and their identities themselves are changed through food in the diaspora, that you come up with these new identities, but also new fusion foods, which have, again, perhaps particular meanings. And yeah, obviously these things are not separate from one another. So I've got some specific questions for each of you. So Debanjali first, which I thought, yeah, a great paper. And as I said, very evocative images. It really brought the paper to life, I think, seeing those images after having read the paper previously. I suppose it would be interesting to know perhaps a little more than the paper goes into about the social stigma of fermentation itself. And again, this is a question that could perhaps have been posed to some of the speakers of the previous panels as well. And you know how those particular prejudices jar with other kinds of norms. You know, we learn of the impacts of this stigma, we learn about higher rents and so on, but not necessarily about the origins. I wonder if there was a deeper history of fermentation itself that could be explored here, or whether it's simply that practices associated with the Northeast are stigmatized by the mainstream. You know, I guess it's, you know, which one comes first, and I imagine they're probably both implicated there. And then for Young, again, a lovely evocative presentation with some great images, very clear. The questions I had, I suppose, were mainly related to some of the detail. I wondered, as I was reading it and also as I was listening to it, where the women were in this, given that they made the Chang back in the village. I wondered whether, you know, were they still back in the village, or whether did they migrate with the men, with their menfolk? And if they did, why it was no longer plausible in the city, for example, to have people into their homes for food, that you hired a hall, you had caterers in, and so on. You know, if they ordered catered food, well, who was it who was cooking it? What kind of food was that, given that it reflected perhaps their particular cuisine? I guess also for the other speakers too, there's often this ambivalence that you talked about, you know, foods that are valued, but which they know potentially evoke disgust, or other kinds of reactions in others. And yeah, it's interesting to hear about how those tensions are balanced in various different kinds of ways. And then for Marilena, finally, I again really liked the paper. I liked and bought into that argument, and in particular this idea that a diasporic identity isn't simply one that's betwixt and between, which is, I think, how perhaps they're sometimes thought of. You know, you're not just neither of either of the places, the place you come from or the place that you end up in. But it creates these additional distinctive identities in their own right. And in this case, it's an identity which also allows new kinds of experimentation with food. I suppose my question, and this may be a rather unfair question, because I'm someone who's always struggled a bit with Peircean semiotics. I think I've only really encountered it through Val Daniel's work on personhood in South India, which was, I think, written in maybe back in 1984. But I suppose I did wonder how helpful the semiotic framing was in making the points of the paper. It seemed to me perhaps that it didn't need that theoretical apparatus, but I'm perfectly happy to be persuaded otherwise on that. So I think that's all I'm going to say on that. If you would like to respond, perhaps we should go in the order that the papers were presented. You don't have to answer all of those things. And again, brevity is valued so that we can not run over too much on time. So Debanjali, would you like to?
Sure. Thank you, James. Thank you, Professor Staples. Quickly, yes. The social history of fermentation in Northeast and Eastern India goes back a long time. This sort of discrimination between cooked food and fermented food, much to reflect what was being said previously about pakka food and kacha food, there is a kind of disdain amongst some communities. I'm a Bengali. In my side of Bengal, people generally don't eat aged rice or fermented rice, but on the Bangladesh side, or communities who have migrated from there, they eat something called panta bhat. So for a long time, people, again, I was born and brought up in Calcutta, people thought panta bhat is distasteful because it's aged rice. Why would you eat that? So there are these little circuits of little notions of what is a preferred dominant cuisine to what is a marginalized cuisine also comes from the marginalization of the region, and it not just limits itself to fermentation, but also various different kinds of eating. Within Greater Northeast, and I'll just concentrate on Manipur, fermented food is everywhere. Every religion, every group, social group, they would have some form of fermented food, whether it's vegetarian or non-vegetarian. It's a part of their vegetarian cuisine. It's a part of their daily life, their festival, their ritual food. It just comes up as something that's part of their everyday life: food processing, food sourcing, selling, making. It's a part of their lives. But even then, there is a hierarchy. And I think someone was mentioning it about the Brahmin food. So there is the Meitei Hindu food, which is always cooked by Brahmin and in specially ritual settings. And even they use fermented bamboo shoots, but the kind of food they cook, they will never cook it with fermented fish because it's non-vegetarian and they are not supposed to cook with it. Even further northeast, if you see, the discrimination even continues about certain kinds of what you eat. For example, in some places in Mizoram and Arunachal, you eat charred rats, but that's eaten also because to protect the granary. The rats will attack the granaries or the bamboo groves. Therefore, in their food culture, in their food ways, they have found a way to incorporate those and then eat that. And that, again, in this larger Northeast context, people say, oh, they eat very different things. Ours is a little more less adventurous. So the hierarchies continue as well. And it also reflects the economy of the region, because foraging for herbs and shoots is something very common. You don't always have to go to the market to find the herbs to flavor your food with. You can forage and find them as well. So you eat what you find, and you grow whatever every part of eat whatever every part of you is grown. So that is also seen in various of the Meitei and tribal cuisine. So that discrimination comes from they eat anything to we eat. We have very structured food system. And yes, it can connect back to that very North Indian food preferences that, there is a dominant idea of what is Indian food, not just in India or North India, South India divide, but also in England. I mean, if you go back to the argument about South Asian curry houses, the fare that is sort of given is somewhat similar. The sharp tastes are missing, unless of course there are specialized cuisines. Or if you go to the deeper end of East Ham or South Hall, you'll find very particular cuisines. But overall, whatever you see as Indian restaurants will have similar flavors. So distinction, that taste, which is so crucial to the Manipuris making their own food, and which comes with the liberal use of chili or the fermented food, which completely changes the way the dal is made or the fish curry is made, is not seen in the larger Indian food system in India or in the UK.
Thanks, that's fascinating. Yeah, great to know. Young, would you like to?
Yes, thanks, James, for your question. So with regard to the women's preference of the migration, generally speaking, women compared to men didn't like to migrate to the urban context. For several years, they practiced circular migration, season by season, to the city and the village, but they reluctantly eventually followed to their husbands and permanently migrate to the capital, since there are still, you can find a lot of your cousins and families, friends, and there. With regard to food, in terms of the catered food, it's not the Sherpa style of cuisine. It's just Nepali general cuisine, relatively high quality. You can find like fried chicken, fried potatoes, and several types of meat and rice and so on. But at least in the cuisine in home, in the urban context, they you'd say that they maintain Sherpa style food, but in a selective way. They started to using start to use some Nepali general spices as well, in a way that, you know, any non-Sherpa Nepalis can enjoy, right? Yeah. And then that's a sort of a cuisine and eating habits that I was able to see and observe in other contexts as well, in the United States, in South Korea as well. I visited their homes, and they generally practice that style of Sherpa cuisine. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you. And Marilena, last but not least.
Yeah, thank you, James, for your question. Actually, I just briefly mentioned first twice in the paper. The first time is just to clarify the meaning of iconic and indexical, but I'm basing my argument mostly on Silverstein and his idea of the iconic indexical aspect of rituals as emblematic of any interactive situation. And the second time, when I talk about quality science, just to highlight the fact, and also I draw on a special issue on quality science, and it's just to refer to the fact that qualities of food are often associated, as we've seen also in other presentations, with moral ideas. If anything, actually, in terms of where the semiotic can help here, if anything, I'm drawing on another trend of semiotics, which is the Paris School of Semiotics, continental semiotics, which is different from person semiotics and looks at, instead of looking at signs, focuses on communicative situations understood in a broader way, and textuality understood very much in a similar way as what Silverstein does. So yeah, that's theoretical background.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I probably need to read up more on my semiotics. If anybody does have a question in the room, in the Zoom room, please raise your hand. But I know also that we have some questions from the YouTube stream. Peggy, are you going to tell us what some of those are?
Yes, we have a series of questions. I'll read the first one. The first one is for Debanjali from Rohini Rai. Do or can indigenous food geographies transcend or challenge bordering processes imposed by the nation states and the reification of the Indian nation or Indianness? Sorry, did you get that, Debanjali?
Can you say that one more time, please?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so Rohini Rai asks, directed question to you. Do or can indigenous food geographies transcend or challenge bordering processes imposed by the nation states and the reification of the Indian nation or Indianness?
I think at this moment I have to think about it, but something I can say from speaking about the fermented fish industry is that a lot of the fish that is, well, in the UK, a lot of what is known as, given that Manipur is in India and we say that it's part of a larger Indian cuisine, we can say that, you know, sometimes that border is transgressed when we are using the Bangladeshi food in Indian cuisine, but that sort of transgression is only where, you know, the international borderline has been sort of drawn, and food cultures in those close areas are shared. So if that can be seen as a way to challenge the Indianness, then probably that is one thing, but I really have to think more about this question. At this moment, I don't have a sort of more introspective answer on this.
I think that's perfectly acceptable. It's a good big question, so absolutely fine to take that away and think about it. Another question, this one coming from Pramila Tamang to Jung. She asks, given that it was Chung and not alcohol in general, to what extent did Sherpas perceive negative views about Chung to caste-based and hill versus mountain people discrimination?
Okay. It's important to see that the Sherpas are a distinctive group of people, and with regard to caste hierarchy in Nepal, Sherpas are distinctive in the sense that they are considered to lack a caste, i.e., they are located at the bottom of the hierarchy, but at the same time, they earned a great level of reputation as an ethnic group. Right? It's quite unusual. So, so in the village context, ethnicity, and at the same time, in the village context, ethnicity is less important than autochthony. If you go to the village context in rural area, people identify each other rather than their origination of certain village, rather than whether they are the Sherpa or Rai or whatever ethnic category. Here, Chang is a symbol of rurality, but at the same time, it's a symbol of autochthony. So, and autochthony is a real power for them that made them to succeed in the urban context. So that's why Chang is selectively, ambiguity is there, ambivalence is there. Chang is at the same time is idolized, but at the same time is rejected, right? So, and the question of with regard to the question, Sherpas do not have that much developed idea of rejection toward the caste hierarchy, the other non-Sherpa, the lower the ethnic groups in the lower ranked in the hierarchy of the caste. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Young. Interesting material again. Another question again from Pramila, and then a following one that both directed this time to Marilena. So 2 questions from Marilena. First from Pramila Tamang. What has been the response of innovation of Newar food in the UK, such as the chaku buns by their community? What about innovation of the Newar food by non-Newar foods with chefs like Santosh Shah? So that's question 1. And a follow-up question from Amanda Lanzillo related to Pramila's question. I'm interested to know more about the audience for these videos. To what extent are they exclusively or primarily Newar, or do they speak to wider UK-based communities? So both questions to you, Marilena.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for these questions. Response to innovation. They're mostly, some people have asked for recipes to this particular interlocutor I was talking about, and because he owns a restaurant, and he is quite active on social media when posting new recipes, but also when relaunching old traditional recipes that he remembers from his childhood. So the community is often quite positive in terms of response to those innovations. Also because he has a great reputation in the community. He is one of those who have been working for the promotion of Newar culture in the diaspora, and he spends a lot of time with the community organizing events. So his reputation also kind of makes him the right person to really suggest those innovations. What about innovation of Newar food from non-Newar chefs like Santosh Shah? Well, Santosh Shah actually worked with this particular interlocutor I mentioned because he learned about yomori, which is one of the dishes that he proposed in MasterChef from him. And we were at this gathering where there was a yomori competition, so the elongated dumplings filled with molasses. My interlocutor had started had organized this event because this particular food, yomori, is traditionally cooked during a festival which is called Yomori Puni, so the full moon of Yomori. So the name comes from the food itself, and he learned, Santosh Shah learned about this dish from that event, and then they worked together to develop it and to make it something that could be presented in MasterChef. Of course, not everybody agrees that what you see on MasterChef is actually yomori. So there is a sort of there is a range of possibilities, And then there is this one, this level of this border, we can say, or this limit that if overcome can make the dish unrecognizable. So some of my interlocutors would say, actually, and there was a debate on this. There was a Zoom meeting on heritage, and they discussed also this issue. Is that Yomori? Can that be called Yomori? Is it still recognizable as Yomori? But there are different opinions on that. And then, sorry, the last one was, do they, I couldn't complete writing the last question. Do they speak? So could you please remind me the last question? Yeah,
that's fine. Yes, from Amanda Lenzilo, related to Pramila's question, the one you just answered. I'm interested to know more about the audience for these videos. To what extent are they exclusively or primarily Newar, or do they speak to a wider UK-based community?
I think they're primarily, I can safely say they're primarily Newar, although the community also includes members of the community. Well, it's not an ethnic association that they belong to. There is an association within which they're active, but it's not an ethnic association, so they welcome everybody. And so there are also non-Newars who participate in events, but I would say that the audience is mostly Newar, and they've tried, and they tried through also MasterChef and Santosh to kind of publicize Newar food more specifically, as opposed to Indian or Nepali food. But this hasn't been successful so far, so they're still working on it. So reflexively thinking about ways in which they can brand this particular type of food and bring it within the discourse on gastronomy. So appealing to a wider public.
Thanks very much, Marilena. Back to you, James.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think we have a final question, which is going to be posed to all of you from Kieran. Are you still with us, Kieran? I think that you'll put it in the chat box and sent it to Debanjali.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, James.
Getting dark there.
Well, this question comes from the fact that I experienced this when I lived in the US. I remember going and picking up a package of pre-made paranthas made by Pillsbury. And, very noticeably it says, that it should remind you of your mother's paranthas. And eventually I tried to find out where it was made, and it was interesting that some of these paranthas were made in India but traveled all the way to the US. So this global circuit of creating nostalgia, and in some ways the market really mediates in our expressions and articulations, and re-emergence in some ways of identities. So I just wanted to hear what others had to say. And additionally, I have one little comment for Debanjali. In one of the master chefs, the contestant, who was from Bangladesh, created one of her final dishes, or one of those dishes, which created quite a ripple. And it could, it had a sort of a contagion effect, I could say. This dish was a pantabat, which is a fermented rice dish with borta, which is a very typically Bengali, East Bengal preparation. And soon after that, Instagram was filled with varieties and variations on the pantas bath. And it wasn't just the lower classes who are more prone to using fermented food, but a whole variety of food practitioners and media influencers who kind of wanted to ride on this bandwagon of fermented food. I wonder what you have to say to that.
You want to start, Debanjali, and then we can go
Yes,
to
absolutely. Professor Bhushya, unfortunately, I haven't seen that episode, but I remember that someone in MasterChef Australia, I think, made bhaji, and that also again went very viral. It's like, you go to a place like MasterChef and you make the simplest dish, which is fritters, and that also became had a contagion effect, but probably more what is called meme worthy and laughable than the other. But it's strange to think that virality, and I'm just thinking through this, can be different, because a lot of these foods which are part of the indigenous food cultures and over and across the northeastern states, some of them were questioned a lot when the COVID pandemic was happening. Is that what they're eating? Is that what's giving us the virus? Kind of a question that then got attached to this other forms of racism, the more dominant forms of racism in the country. In the early months when the coronavirus pandemic was happening, a lot of Northeasterners had to face that, saying that you gave us COVID. It was your lot. It was your fresh market food, the frogs that you eat, the bugs that you eat. The virus may have just come from there and not from across the international border. And that sort of a virality is also very common. So it just takes that one moment in social media for something to turn viral. In this case, panta bhat, which is a very ubiquitous dish in many Bengali households, especially from those who belong to Bangladesh and who has roots in eastern, earlier East Pakistan or Bengal. And it's sort of recognized as this sometimes jovial, sometimes discriminatory kind of humorous exchanges that, you guys eat everything fermented and spicy. So virality can go in two different ways as well.
Young, do you want to add anything? No. And Marilena, did you?
Actually, I just wanted to go back to your initial question, if possible, on changes. And I just wanted to add that food changes also, and perception of food, whether backward or rural or healthy or unhealthy, so the values added to it also change generationally. So that what I'm talking about in my paper is also limited to a certain portion, let's say, of the diaspora that, for example, has experience or memory of the food that they would eat in Nepal. And younger people might perhaps relate to some items, but not to others. And they would feel that they're too oily, too unhealthy for them to be consumed. So transformation goes also through generations.
Great. Yeah, that's useful. Thank you very much. I'll do give you a virtual clap to everybody on this panel and throughout the day. That concludes then the four panels. I was going to move now to the final thing, which is my final words, as I've called them. We did debate, myself and the other chairs, we did debate about whether it would be a good idea to try and get in, a big name speaker to give a closing address. But we figured that after nearly 8 hours online and 16 papers, that we might all be a bit too tired to fully appreciate it. So instead, you've just got me and a few thoughts trying to pull together some of the themes to come out of this very varied, very empirically rich, really fascinating set of papers, which I think taken together provoke some really interesting questions. And, genuinely, it was a wonderful reprieve from the more bureaucratic work that lots of us who work in universities spend a lot of time doing, and I think served as a reminder why I wanted to work in academia in the first place. So thank you very much for that. So yeah, these are really just my first slightly unformed thoughts on how these papers fit together. So this isn't meant as a last word, even though it's the final word today. So we began with a panel way back at 9 o'clock this morning, which we called Encountering Modernity, Food in a Liberalizing South Asia. And Suchi's fascinating account of an English afternoon tea workshop, this grooming workshop in Delhi, which explores the ways upper caste and upper class Indians, I think by and large, might learn what she calls the presumed aesthetics of a global lifestyle, and with which comes a kind of globalized cuisine, somehow unanchored to place. And I think the very question of what characteristics a food needs to have to be considered international as opposed to local, and therefore parochial, meant here, I think, in a pejorative sense, is a really interesting one. You know, why does, say, pizza, for example, with its origins presumably in Italy, and I'm sure somebody will probably correct me on this, you know, why does this become international when it turns up in India or in Delhi, while dal and rice or fermented bean shoot pickle, for example, doesn't in quite the same way? So there are questions there, I think, about, you know, who makes those judgments and how they make them, and of course why they make them. And then listening to Simran's paper, I wonder if it's a question of provenance, you know, which is obscured in the cases that she talks about by the very platforms that bring food to be delivered directly to your door. You know, and allowing home delivery of food, these apps, these platforms, they perhaps also allow consumers to experiment with different kinds of foods away from what, as we've seen in the other papers, are the social risks involved in getting it wrong. And the stakes, again, as we've seen through several papers in different ways, are quite high. Then in Kieran's paper, we also start to see how these older ideas about food are not simply replaced by the newer ones that have come with economic liberalization and capitalization and these other kinds of things that have been going on. But how these original ideas are reshaped as well in the present. So these old notions of purity and pollution, you know, the very ideas that we find in monographs in the village studies era of the sort of 1950s and 1960s, these ideas are still alive and well in a form in the Himalayan village that she introduces us to. But Dalit families there are now able to manage upper caste fears by offering hospitality through things like pre-prepared biscuits, bakery products, fizzy drinks, and so on. In other words, modern foods that are not quite so encoded in the same way. They're difficult to fit into those older categories and therefore perhaps become acceptable. In the cities like Delhi, they are able to use very similar strategies to those deployed by the workshop participants that Suchi worked with, you know, by adopting certain styles of behavior, by eating in particular ways. By doing those things, they can pass potentially as being upper caste as well as upper middle class, at least in some cases. But the impact of change is felt not only in urban areas, as Thomas's paper demonstrated, which was on, you know, how rice subsidies for the poor have changed the grains that people eat in an Adivasi village in Andhra Pradesh, and also what younger generations consider good to eat. So we've got this generational transformation going on as well. White rice is now prized far more than maize and sorghum, which, although the latter is probably more nutritious, are associated with the hunger of the past. But this isn't simply a preference for the modern over the traditional. And again, we're challenging, I think, these kinds of all too easily made dichotomies. In the case that he describes, hunted meat, which to his interlocutors references a kind of traditional lifestyle, a traditional social life and hospitality, is something that's very much prized. So I think what we see in all these papers are transformations in foodways that in turn are shaping tribal, caste and class identities. But we also see at the same time continuities with that past. And the way these things play out, I think, is extremely interesting. And it would be good to read, in some cases, the longer versions of these papers to see where we might go with them. Then on the second panel, this focus on food subsidies and their impact, which is something that Thomas also reflected on in his paper, is continued. This panel called Putting Hunger, Aid and Food Shortages into context. So Weber Hussein gives us a sense of how strategic decisions by the Indian government, how these fostered dependency on food subsidies for what he thought of as predetermined political purposes. So you've got groups of people, such as those that he describes in Kashmir, who had previously been self-sufficient in grain production, then find themselves reliant on the public distribution system for their staples, for their grains. And whether this was actively pursued as a strategy by the government or was a convenient, well, at least convenient for the government, side effect of that, I'm not so sure. I wonder if there are lots of factors coming together here. Perhaps that credits central governments with more strategic insight than they sometimes have. But anyway, and then Carla Kay's paper, which we didn't hear today, but some of you certainly in the Zoom room will have read, highlights other problems with the public distribution system. And in her case, the argument seems to be that globalization and economic liberalization has led to increased migration from rural areas to the cities, which has led to a downturn in subsistence agriculture. And this in turn has meant less grain available to be redistributed, which has hampered the potential of the PDS, of the public distribution system. So there's a kind of chain reaction taking place here. And then Venkat's paper also spoke to, I think, potential solutions to alleviating hunger, to some of the problems that were highlighted in some of the other papers through various kinds of agrarian technical solutions. For example, from a shift from millet to paddy, which stands in an interesting kind of contrast to what Thomas was talking about in his paper. But even when food resources are available in particular places, access to food is also significantly shaped by other factors. Gender distinctions very high among those. And as Joanna Morrison and her co-authors note in their paper, expectations and pressures on girls, in this case in Nepal, often result in them having less access to food than their male counterparts. So I think my takeaway here from these very different kinds of papers about hunger and about food shortages in the context of a mesh of other interrelated factors, including historical ones like the Green Revolution, for example, but also more localized social, cultural, political, and ecological factors, that we need to see these proximate causes in relation to that wider context or set of contexts. And certainly it's worth pointing out, I think, that even if it's not explicitly dealt with in any of those papers, that the effects of climate change and environmental degradation are having a really significant impact on food production and distribution in the contemporary moment. And this isn't something that's going to go away. And then consideration of how people are marginalized through food, which was something that Joanna Morrison's paper attended to in relation to gender, was also at the center of the third panel, resistance and beyond eating at the margins. And what came out for me from all these papers was a very timely reminder that South Asian cuisine isn't simply a single category with these regional or other differences, all variations on a kind of central theme. And as the authors of those papers, I think, all demonstrated very well, when we treat the category, this category of South Asian food or even of Indian food or Nepali food as relatively heterogeneous, it privileges what we might think of as a hegemonic cuisine and obscures the alternatives. And we might think back here also to the distinction made by a paper in the first panel between international and regional cuisines. That these aren't simply innocent categories, that we put boundaries around things, we make up these categories often for particular kinds of political purposes. And what we actually have in some cases, it seems to me, are potentially wholly different foodways we might see as not necessarily being connected in the same way, partly in terms of what gets eaten, the particular things that get eaten, but also in relation to how food is sourced, how food is prepared and cooked, even how the fire is lit, in terms also of the meanings associated with food. And again, that comes up I think, in papers also in the final in the final panel. So in Biswas and Xaxa's paper, for example, we see some of the detail of how Gond Adivasi communities in India prepare food. Even to the extent of not using matches to light a fire, having and we can think of all sorts of things about how the ways of different firewood impart different flavors and so on to the food. Now, in Priyanka's paper about queer food cultures, alternative domestic setups to the, I suppose, hegemonic, heteronormative family challenge the ways that gender is inscribed into food preparation. And the fermented bamboo shoot pickle, that was an important part of Aditi's everyday diet, for example, was not only marginalized vis-a-vis other cuisines, but was prepared almost exclusively by women. So you've got these intersections of things that are going on as well. And then Regina's discussion of indigenous food restaurants in Jharkhand and Meghalaya reminds us that eating itself is a political act, an everyday form of resistance that's also infused with nostalgia, with culture and historical memory. So we see how the discrimination against marginalized communities in the region also intersects with other identity categories. And those include gender, but they're not limited, I think, to gender, and how they're all manifest in different ways through foodways. Now, there are also strong resonances in Debanjali's paper in the final panel, which we've just heard on migration, food and identity, with those on marginality. She also writes about fermented foods and about how in Indian contexts away from the Northeast, the pungent smells associated with it themselves are stigmatized and serve to mark out those people as inferior. Overall, though, in this final panel, which I've spoken about already in my summing up, so I'm not going to repeat everything I've already said here, but what I was struck by were, well, I think I have already said this, but what I was struck by were the transformations or otherwise associated with food and people as it moves and as it moves with people to new locations. In some of the papers, it was the meaning of the food or of the drink that changed as it crossed over borders. In others, the focus was on how the food itself was transformed in all sorts of different ways, sometimes because of lack of ingredients, sometimes because of experimentation, sometimes because of being fused with other cuisines. And we also see how identities or how people and their identities themselves are changed through food in the diaspora. And I think in all those cases, it seemed to me that foodways are very good at making concrete these transformations that come with migration that are otherwise sometimes hard to see. So just final word, I guess, and it's perhaps unwise to draw firm conclusions from papers in progress, which have only just been presented, in which we crudely split into 4 very generally themed panels. I suppose my final and rather general point is that the study of foodways has something really important to contribute to any exploration of how South Asia and its diasporas, its many diasporas, have changed in the 75 years since India's independence. And food, I think, is great at making tangible things going on in the society that are otherwise sometimes hard to pin down or otherwise elided or hidden. So finally, then, again, thanks in closing. I mean, I'll allow people five minutes or so afterwards in case there are any urgent questions, but I do want to thank all of our paper givers today, all of you. Thank you very much, particularly those of you who have had to present very late at night, or in some cases were here very early in the morning. It's coming from the US. Also my co-chairs, Luke, Debanjali and Peggy, Nafisa, my intern, Nilanjan, and yeah, everybody who's turned up also and supported us on YouTube and continue with the discussion there. So finally, I will shut up. But if there are any further questions, please feel free to raise your hands now. Otherwise, we'll close the proceedings. Debanjali, do you want to put your camera on as well, so we can have the chairs on? And perhaps we should all put our cameras on for the final farewell. Great. Is there one new message? Thank you, Tom, for your comment there. And James is a big name speaker. Not sure that's the case. Okay, so, well, thank you very much. Our speakers, I will send an email to everybody. And as I understand it, the YouTube link will continue. The recording from the YouTube links will be available on YouTube, so you can go back and revisit your own papers and those of the others and the questions at your leisure. We've also made some notes, so we will try to send all of you hopefully a summary of the questions that you were asked, and yeah, any of the feedback that we've picked up. But yeah, thank you very much.